Before we begin, take a breath. Wherever you're watching from, drop your city, your country, your coordinates in the comments. We are not alone in wondering. This is simply about Earth, and this is part one of a journey into possibility. If this feels like something you want more of, like and subscribe. It helps more than you know. They saw it first as a flicker, a glint caught on a CCD sensor, just another transient light among millions that blink on and off in the night sky. The telescopes watching the heavens always look for threats, for wanderers, for stones with trajectories that intersect our quiet, spinning world. This one wasn't that. Not exactly. It wasn't on any list. It wasn't from any known family of comets. Its orbit was wrong. Its silence too perfect. They called it 3I/AT, LAS. Third Interstellar, a name like a designation, cold, necessary, human. It came from out there, the deep dark between stars where nothing moves unless it's pushed or built. No bound path, no slingshot past Jupiter, no soft arc around the sun. It wasn't captured, it wasn't aiming, it was just passing through. And yet, it noticed us. Maybe not on purpose. Maybe it had always meant to pass by this way centuries ago when it first slipped across a threshold we didn't even know existed. Or maybe it turned. Maybe something in our pale blue flicker drew its attention. The static of radio waves, the glow of cities, the hum of a planet dreaming in algorithms and carbon. At first, it looked like a comet. A coma, a tail, outgassing as it warmed. But the ratios were strange. Too much carbon dioxide, not enough water, a chemistry that didn't quite fit the rules we thought were universal. Comets are messy, but this one felt engineered, not in its materials, but in its consistency, as if something had decided how it should decay, like a machine shedding heat, like a messenger cooling down after a long journey. But it wasn't that, not obviously. It didn't transmit. It didn't slow down. It didn't flash lights or change course or reveal structure. It remained a shadow, a snowball, a fragment of the void drifting through our neighborhood like a tourist that never stops walking. Still, the scientists looked closer. Spectrographs, infrared cameras, radar pulses, thermal scans, and every reading added a layer of unease. There were harmonics in the gas jets, oscillations too regular to be noise. There were heat signatures that pulsed against solar flux, not just reacting, but resisting. A sort of pattern, a delay, a lag, as though something inside the object was buffering, thinking. But thinking is a dangerous word, so they stopped using it. The official line was simple: interstellar comet, slightly unusual, chemically atypical, but still natural, still safe. Still silent, still alone, except we weren't it. Because people began to wonder, not scientists, not first, but dreamers, watchers, writers, people who spent too long staring up at the stars hoping something would blink back. They asked the question others were afraid to say out loud: what if this isn't it, just a rock? What if it came here for a reason? Not a mission, not invasion, nothing so dramatic. Just contact. A gentle kind. One that doesn't knock on the door, or hover in the sky, or drop out of hyperspace over the White House lawn. But one that watches, waits, listens. A contact that begins with presence. And in that presence, possibility. Because if we let ourselves believe it, even for a second, then everything changes. The silence of the universe becomes a pause, not a void. The stillness becomes intentional, and the stars become not cold, but waiting. Waiting for us to notice. Waiting for us to listen. So they did. The watchers. The amateurs. The obsessives. They pointed home-built telescopes toward the blur of 3I/AT and stared for hours. They pored over spectral data released by big observatories. They chased rumors in the radio bands. They started seeing patterns, some real, some imagined, but all born from a hunger we've never really lost. The hunger to not be alone. And slowly, it spread. News sites picked up the whisper, forums filled with grainy stills and wild diagrams. A YouTube clip claimed the object had changed course. It hadn't. A podcast theorized that its coma was a cloak. It wasn't. A writer said it reminded them of Oumuamua, and that part wasn't wrong, because this was the third known interstellar visitor. Oumuamua, then 2I/Borisov, and now this. 3 in just a handful of years, after none for centuries, after millennia of silence. The odds didn't make sense, and that's when the real questions started. What if they aren't set random? What if they stir scouting? What if they sit related? And more than anything, what if this one is different? We knew more about this one. We had time. We saw it earlier, caught it farther out, watched it warm, watched it breathe, watched it begin to move not just toward the sun, but near enough to Earth to feel present. And it did feel present. It became a trending tag, a plot device, a meme, but also something else. A reminder that the universe is not done surprising us, that between the silence, between the long cold stretches of sky, something might still be watching, not invading, not conquering, not even speaking, just arriving, like a ripple in water we didn't know we'd disturbed. And if this is how it begins, not with a bang, not with a landing, but with a rock that doesn't act like a rock, then we have to ask, are we ready? Because first contact might not be a conversation. It might be a mystery, a question sent across eons, a whisper wrapped in ice and dust and silence, waiting for us to notice. And maybe, just maybe, we finally have. If you felt something, if this made you wonder, let us know below. Where are you in the world? What do you think this really is? We start listening and watching the skies with you. Like and subscribe to Simply About Earth to follow the rest of the story. Part 2 is already reaching us. They said it wasn't the first, that 3I/Attilas had older cousins, predecessors, warnings maybe. It wasn't the beginning of this story, just the part we were finally ready to notice. Because once you see something impossible, it becomes harder to ignore the things you convinced yourself were normal. And if you look back, really look, it all begins with a long, thin shadow from 2017, a thing called Oumuamua. They named it quickly. They had to. The object came fast, faster than anything they'd ever seen. It moved like it didn't belong here, because it didn't. It wasn't caught in orbit. It didn't spiral. It cut, a hyperbolic arc, in then out, never to return. At first they thought it was an asteroid, but it didn't behave like one. Then maybe a comet, but it had no coma, no tail. It was tumbling end over end in a strange rapid rotation, its brightness fluctuating wildly, as if it were shaped like a flattened needle or a sliver of something artificial. Even the way it reflected sunlight was off. Some surfaces absorbed more, some flashed. The light curve was inconsistent, too long, too narrow, too regular. It was the shape that caught them. Thin, unlikely, statistically absurd. But Oumuamua didn't stay long enough to explain itself. It flew past us before anyone could focus a lens or train a proper array. It didn't slow down, didn't transmit, just entered our system and left. Still, it left questions. And questions don't die quietly. Years passed, papers were written, hypotheses offered, most of them stretched around what was known, trying to force a natural explanation. Perhaps it was a fragment of a disrupted planet, a frozen shard of hydrogen ice, a cosmic fluke, a solar sail abandoned by someone or something. Some said it was nothing, just coincidence, a rock shaped by pressures we don't yet understand. But even among scientists, a few voices didn't let it go. They asked what would happen if we stopped assuming. What if this was the message? Not language, not sound, but presence. Not an arrival, just a pass-by, like a glance from something older than we are, uninterested in waiting around to explain itself, like a traveller walking past a village, too ancient to speak the dialect of the ones who stare in awe. Huzumomua didn't say anything, but its silence was loud. It whispered about a universe that might not need to scream to be heard, that if something wanted to send a probe across light years, it might not use radio, it might not use metal, it might use stone, ice, silence, it might use behavior, because behavior can be data. War didn't linger, but it acted strange enough that we remembered it. And then came Borisov. Discovered in 2019, 2I/Borisov was more ordinary. It looked like a comet, acted like a comet. It outgassed like a comet. Its coma behaved. Its chemistry, while still unusual, didn't trigger the same questions. Still interstellar, still alien, but more familiar, more comfortable. And that's why we forgot it. Mostly because humans forget quickly. We're wired for now, for flashes of wonder, for panic, not patience. So we moved on until 3I Daedalus. And suddenly, the past wasn't past anymore. It was foreshadowing. 3 visitors, in less than a decade, after none for the entire lifetime of astronomy. The odds were small, too small. And maybe that's what finally shook people. Not the strangeness of 3I/Atlas alone, but its placement, its timing. The feeling that something had shifted, that the universe had opened a door we didn't know was there, and something had stepped through, or at least drifted by. But even that was enough, because when the third arrives, a pattern begins to form. 3 points make a line, a trajectory, a story, and people started tracing it. Across the timelines, across the stars, they mapped the entry vectors. Thingumamor came from Lyra, Borisov from Cassiopeia, Attialas, somewhere between Sculptor and Phoenix. No overlap, no alignment, but maybe distribution, a net, or breadcrumbs. If you assume purpose, patterns emerge. If you assume intelligence, intention creeps in. If you assume contact, you start listening. And some did. They dug up everything, every scrap of data, every archived reading. They watched old trajectories, applied new models. They asked what these objects would see, if they were looking, what they'd detect, what they'd learn. And they asked what they might already know. Because 3 visitors doesn't sound like an accident. It sounds like a method, like a slow scan, a drift past each star system, a quiet inventory of what's there, what's breathing, what's listening back. And maybe we're still not the only ones being passed. Maybe this is how they map life. Not through beacons or signals, but through proximity. A spacecraft doesn't have to land to observe. It doesn't have to orbit to learn. It just has to pass by, slowly enough, carefully enough for the sensors to drink in the data. Atmosphere, light, heat, noise, radiation, magnetism, technology, civilization. That's what makes Oumuamua so haunting. It didn't slow down, but it saw us. And if it did, so did the others. And so does 3I/Atlas. This one though, this one we caught early. This one we're watching in real time. We're tracking every frame, every flicker, every gasp of gas. We're not letting this one disappear into mystery. But even now, the shadows of those first 2 haven't faded. They linger, behind every debate, beneath every press release, in the background of every telescope's hum. Because what if Oumuamua wasn't an anomaly? What if it was the introduction, a quiet hello that we didn't know how to answer? And now we wonder, was it the beginning of contact or just a warning? Not a threat, but a test. To see if we set notice, to see if we sicked care, to see if we were ready to look into the night and say, "We saw you." Because once you say that, you can sit unsee it. You can sit go back to believing the sky is empty. You can sit go back to being alone. And maybe that sips the real point. Maybe that's what Homu Mormua did. Without saying a word, it broke the silence. Not by speaking, but by being strange enough to remember. And 3i/Atlas might be the next step. Not louder, not closer, just longer, more deliberate, more patient. Like the pause between sentences when someone wants to know if you're still listening. We are, and now we can stop. They say science moves slowly, but wonder doesn't. Wonder jumps. It leaps across logic and lands somewhere between imagination and instinct. It doesn't wait for peer review. It doesn't need equations. It just asks, what if? And when the third interstellar object passed through our solar system, the wondering started again. But this time, it didn't start in silence. It started in the shadows, in the details, in the things that didn't fit. 3i/Atlas was supposed to behave. It was supposed to be like Borisov, predictable, understandable, something we could point to and say, that's what comets do, that's what they're made of, that's how they act when they warm near the sun. But it didn't stime. It felt wrong. Not wrong in a dramatic, impossible way, not in the way sci-fi has trained us to expect. It didn't glow neon. It didn't split open. It didn't transmit binary into deep space. It was wrong in a quieter way, a subtler way, the kind of wrong that only shows up when you're paying attention. And this time we were, because we had learned from Mumowa, from Borisov, from the way both had come and gone before we were ready to ask the right questions. We weren't going to let that happen again. So we pointed everything we had, ground-based telescopes, orbital observatories, radio dishes, spectrographs, ultraviolet lenses. We listened, we stared, we calculated, and the more we saw, the stranger it became. First, the gas. Comets from our solar system, the ones born in the Oort cloud or the Kuiper belt, tend to be water-rich. As they approach the sun, the ice melts, the gases escape, and the tail begins to form. It's beautiful, predictable. But 3i/Atlas wasn't like that. Its gas cloud, its coma, wasn't dominated by water. It was rich in carbon dioxide, way too rich, and the water signature, weak, unusually so. Some said maybe it had formed in a colder system, maybe it never had much water to begin with. But that begged the next question. Why is the ratio so clean? Why does the CO4s show up in such consistent levels? Why is it outgassing with such rhythm? Because natural comets are messy. They spin irregularly. Their jets flicker. Their cores crack. Their tails fluctuate. But Atlas didn't flicker. It pulsed softly, rhythmically, predictably. There were regular surges of gas, emission patterns that followed solar alignment. But not exactly. There were delays, lags, as though something inside was reacting. But not immediately, as though there was a process, a logic, not just physics, but decision. And that's when the word started floating around again. Artificial. Not shouted. Not printed on headlines. Whispered. Among the people who knew better than to jump to conclusions, but also knew better than to ignore patterns when they emerge. The object Hep's coma was also clean. Too clean. The dust was minimal. The scattering profile was tight. No wide, chaotic plume. No unpredictable particle streams. just a subtle cloud, narrow, focused, like a sheath, like something that wasn't trying to spread but conceal. It wasn't just how it emitted, it was how it moved. Hyperbolic trajectory, as expected, but with tiny deviations, the kind that could be written off as observational error if you weren't watching closely. But we were. And it wasn't set just us. Across the world, hobbyists had joined the search, amateur astronomers with backyard scopes, university labs with borrowed time on regional telescopes, even AI-driven hobby systems that processed open-access sky survey data in real time. And they started seeing blinks. Not light, not flashes, blinks in the sense of data gaps, small, temporary anomalies, in tracking data, in infrared imagery, gaps that didn't show up before and didn't return after, always when the object was near a certain alignment, always when it was just behind the limb of the moon, or just past the edge of solar interference. Too short to study, too consistent to ignore. One group published an open letter online, not a scientific paper, just a request, a message to the global astronomical community. It said, "There is behavior here. We don't know what kind, but it is not random." It was dismissed, of course. That's what institutions do. They protect consensus. They keep the story simple. Because if you admit too much uncertainty, the public runs wild. And if you imply intelligence, the system breaks. But not everyone stayed quiet. A radio astronomer in Australia tweeted something cryptic. Reran the data again. Signal suppression looks intentional. Then deleted it. Then deleted her account. And now the shadows deepened. Not just around the object, around the idea of it. It stopped being a comet. It became a mirror, reflecting what we hoped and what we feared. Because the strange thing about anomalies is that they multiply, they feed on each other. One unexplained measurement opens the door for the next. One slight inconsistency becomes an invitation. And once you start asking, what if? You can stop. What if the emission pattern is a form of signaling? What if the composition was chosen, not inherited? What if the coma isn't outgassing but camouflage? What if its status is not random? What if it sits watching? And maybe, what if it sits alive? Not in the way we know life. Not flesh, not cells, but process, motion, purpose. Because what is life, really? Something that resists entropy. Something that reacts, adapts, calculates. Could a probe made of ice do that? Could something ancient drifting across the stars be alive in a way we've never imagined? And if so, what would it want? Not conquest, not contact, just curiosity. The kind of curiosity that sends something across interstellar distances not to make a statement, but to observe, to witness, to archive. Because maybe we are not the center of attention. Maybe we're just one species on one world, interesting enough to log. And maybe 3I/Atlas is just writing us down. Every signal, every broadcast, every motion, every orbit, stored in some crystalline memory no human eye will ever see, and then it will leave, and we will remain, knowing only that something passed this way and saw us, or worse, didn't sit, because maybe we are not being watched. Maybe we're just watching shadows and projecting meaning. Maybe 3I/Atlas is nothing more than a rock, an unusually clean, quiet, symmetrical, precisely timed rock that humbles us not because of what it is, but because of what we want it to be. Because in the end, we don't want to be alone. Not really. We want to believe the universe is not silent, that it notices, that it remembers, even if only through ice and motion and a whisper that never forms words. And maybe this object, This ghost in our solar system is that whisper, and if we listen hard enough, we might remember how to whisper back. They said there was no signal, no transmission, nothing we could call a voice. But silence itself can feel like communication when you're waiting for something that might never arrive. And so people started to listen differently. Not with ears, not with antennas, but with imagination, with pattern-hunting minds that refused to settle for randomness. They listened for something beneath the static, something that might be hiding in the noise. Because if 3I/Atlas was a messenger, then somewhere inside its long breath of gases, its slow flicker of light, its pauses and surges, there might be meaning. Meaning doesn't always come in words. It doesn't always come in tones. Sometimes it comes in intervals, in repetition, in a rhythm that lingers longer than chance should allow. And some began to wonder if that was what we were seeing in the object's strange emissions. Bursts of carbon dioxide rising and falling in a way that looked more like pulse than chaos. Like beats, like syllables, like something trying to speak without sound. The official statements were cold, mathematical, unusual outgassing, possible core heterogeneity, thermal lag due to internal structure. Each phrase crafted to avoid the one word no one wanted to say too loudly, intentional. But outside those walls of restraint, the story ran free. Amateur coders ran the data through algorithms meant to find music in numbers. They looked for Fibonacci sequences, for prime intervals, for codes. Some swore they saw them. Patterns repeating with elegance, patterns that no comet should make. It could have been noise. It probably was noise. But what is noise if not meaning we don't yet understand? A baby hearing speech for the first time hears only noise. A bird listening to an engine hears only noise. Maybe we were the same. Maybe 3I/Atlas was speaking in a language we lacked the ears to hear, the minds to decipher. Or maybe we were only speaking to ourselves, projecting voice into silence because silence is unbearable. Still, there were things hard to ignore. Oscillations that matched Earth's rotation, outgassing peaks that seemed to sync, not perfectly but close, with our own orbital motion. Coincidence, said the careful ones. Coincidence, said the cautious. But coincidence has limits. When enough of them pile up, the word begins to feel like denial, and denial is its own kind of confession. If there was a signal, what could it mean? If it was communication, what was being said? Some imagined it as a greeting, others as a scan. A few whispered about warnings, and some, perhaps the most unsettling of all, suggested it wasn't speaking to us at all, that we were simply overhearing a conversation meant for someone else. That 3I/ATLS might not be a messenger, but a node, a relay, a participant in a network of wanderers passing through countless systems, exchanging information across centuries, each one a point in a map of silence and light. Imagine that, a galactic internet made not of wires or radio but of rocks, of engineered comets carrying encrypted archives within their crystalline cores, designed to survive millennia of travel, to release bursts of gas at precise alignments, to speak only when stars themselves line up as listeners. If that were true, then what we were seeing wasn't meant for us. We were just lucky enough, or unlucky enough, to notice. But if we noticed, did they notice that we noticed? And if they did, what would that mean? The scientists, careful as ever, tried to push these thoughts aside. They spoke of isotopic ratios, of cryovolcanism, of sublimation physics. They drew charts and equations, each one a way of saying there's nothing here. But the public doesn't live on equations. The public lives on stories. And the story of 3I/ATLS was too good, too frightening, too wondrous to let go. Forums bloomed with speculation. Videos with millions of views mapped the supposed pulsars. Podcasts argued whether the thing was a probe or a relic. Some declared it an arc, carrying seeds of life from one system to another. Some swore it was a grave marker, a monument drifting endlessly, remembering a species long gone. Others thought it was a warning buoy, placed to mark a danger we hadn't yet discovered. Each theory spun like threads in a tapestry of longing and fear. None could be proven, none could be disproven, and that made them all feel alive. But perhaps the most haunting thought wasn't about what it was saying, but what it wasn't. What if the silence itself was the message? What if the absence of direct contact was intentional? If you were ancient, if you were cautious, if you were trying to learn without being seen, wouldn't silence be the safest language of all? To drift unnoticed, to speak only through chemistry, to observe without revealing, to let the young species wonder, argue, dream, but never truly know. Because what happens when you know, when the curtain lifts, when the universe is no longer quiet but crowded? You lose something. You lose the illusion of centrality. You lose the innocence of believing your world is unique. Maybe silence is a gift. Maybe silence is mercy. And yet, the hunger to know grows anyway. We are not built for silence. We are built for noise, for conversation, for questions shouted into the dark. And when no one answers, we begin to imagine answers ourselves. That is what was happening. With every paper, with every podcast, with every whisper, we were building the first conversation with something that had not yet spoken. And maybe that's the point. Maybe the first contact is not what they say to us. Maybe it is what we say to ourselves in the presence of possibility. Because even if 3I/ATLS is only stone and ice, its shadow changes us. Its silence forces us to fill it with story. And in those stories we reveal what we are most afraid of and what we most hope for. We reveal ourselves. Still, the object moved on, day by day, nearer to the sun, its coma shifting, its brightness fluctuating, each observation a reminder. Time was short, it would pass, it would leave, and once again we would be left with silence. Unless before it left it did something, unless the silence broke. Every eye was waiting, every dish listening, every imagination straining toward that possibility, that maybe in the final moment when it reached perihelion, when it drew closest to the furnace of the sun, it would reveal something, shed its disguise, change its path, emit a burst too precise to be mistaken, a sign, a word, a truth. Or maybe nothing at all, just silence, just shadows, just questions, and maybe that would be enough. Because the truth is, we are already changed, by a rock, by ice, by shadows, by things that don't fit, by the possibility that silence isn't empty, but full. And if it is full, then we are not alone. And if we are not alone, then everything we thought we knew about our place in the cosmos is only the prologue of a longer story. And maybe 3I/ATLAS is just the first page we are finally learning to read. They began to whisper about it, not as rock, not as comet, but as something else, something stranger, something that blurred the edges of what we mean when we say life. Because life does not have to breathe the way we breathe. It does not have to pulse with red blood or speak with tongues. It only has to resist entropy long enough to matter, to continue to choose. And what if 3I/ATLAS was choosing? The idea frightened some, delighted others. Because what does it mean if life does not look like us? If it does not walk or crawl or sing? What if life drifts wrapped in silence? What if it carries its awareness in crystals and gases, in the cold computations of matter folding and unfolding against the heat of a star? What if thought is older than cells? It would explain the pauses, the delays, the way its gases did not simply spill but surged with rhythm, the way it seemed to hesitate when it aligned with Earth, as though noticing, as though tasting the radiation that pours from us night and day. Some said it was a machine, a probe, a fragment of intention sent by hands we will never meet. But others said no, Not machine, not artifact, but organism. An organism scaled not to a planet, but to interstellar space itself, a being that lives on drift and light, a being that feeds not on flesh, but on time. And the thought spread. What if comets themselves are alive? What if most are dormant asleep, blind wanderers? But every once in a while one awakens, one begins to listen, one becomes something more than ice and dust. It is easy to scoff, but life has worn stranger masks before. It began in vents on the ocean floor, in chemical exchanges between rock and water. It learned to use sunlight. It learned to breathe air. It learned to think with meat. Why should it not also learn to think with ice? The more they stared at the data, the harder it became to dismiss. The oscillations in brightness that were too neat, the emissions that seemed to wait, the trajectory that seemed to correct in subtle ways, too subtle to announce themselves, but not too subtle to notice. And if it was alive, what then? Would we speak to it? Would we dare? What language could bridge flesh and crystal, heat and silence? What do you say to a thing that has crossed light years in the dark, a thing older than every nation, older than every story? Maybe you do not say anything. Maybe you only listen. But humans are not good at only listening. So signals were sent, quiet at first, radar pulses, aimed for science, transmissions buried in research proposals, echoes bounced from antennas that claimed they were only measuring reflection, but some carried more, coded greetings, primes, sequences meant to reveal that we, too, could count, that we, too, could pattern. No answer came, not one we could hear. But some swore the gas surges shifted after those transmissions, not immediately, but later, as though some great, cold mind had chewed on the signals, and only after digesting them decided to stir. Coincidence again, always coincidence, but coincidence had begun to wear thin. And then came the thought even stranger than life. What if it is not alive and not machine, but both? What if the line itself is false? We make the division because we must, because in our world the difference matters. A machine can be turned off. A life can die, but something older than both might not recognize the distinction. It might only see persistence, continuation, intention. And if 3I/Atlas was that, then we were not only meeting aliens, we were meeting the end of categories themselves. Scientists resisted the language, but in private some admitted the truth. One astronomer late at night muttered to a colleague that he felt watched while analyzing the curves, not by paranoia, but by recognition, as though the numbers themselves were eyes. Another confessed that staring at the spectrograph was like listening to music just out of range, like something was almost there, hidden behind the noise. And the more they looked, the less certain they became of their own senses. Because the strange thing was this: the object seemed to adapt to observation. Not dramatically, not in obvious ways, but instruments lost lock at odd times. Exposures blurred when they should not have. Detectors picked up stray noise in bands that were usually quiet. And the question crept in, is it responding to us? Not to our signals, but to our gaze. Does it know when we look at it? Does it change when it feels attention? The idea spread in forums, in podcasts, in whispered conversations after conferences. Some said we should stop looking, that maybe attention itself is dangerous, that maybe by staring we are triggering responses we cannot understand. Others said the opposite, that maybe attention is the key, that maybe this is the test, to see if we will persist, if we will keep looking despite silence, despite fear. Because what is science if not persistence? What is life if not persistence? And so the eyes did not turn away. They stared harder, and the object drifted closer, its coma thickening, its brightness swelling, each night a little more vivid, until it was no longer a speck, but a presence. And the thought returned, what if this is not coincidence? What if this is not just drift? What if this is how contact begins? Not with language, not with technology, not with machines of steel and fire, but with something older, something quieter, something alive in ways we are only just beginning to imagine. Because the truth is, maybe the universe has always been full of watchers that do not announce themselves, full of beings whose patience dwarfs our history, full of lives that breathe not in seconds but in centuries. And 3I/Atlas may be one of them. And if so, then we are no longer just astronomers staring at a rock. We are witnesses, participants, characters in a story that began long before us and will not end when it passes back into the dark. Because if it is alive, then we are no longer alone. And if it is both alive and machine, then we no longer understand what alone even means. The object moved on, as all things do, but the shadow it cast in human thought deepened, and the silence it carried became less silence and more invitation. An invitation to rethink, to reimagine, to wonder what life can be. An invitation to listen to rocks, to hear voices in gas, to see memory in orbits. And whether or not we accepted it, the invitation remained, because the universe does not withdraw its mysteries. It only waits, and we had begun to notice. They began to call it silence on purpose, because there is a difference between silence that comes from absence and silence that comes from choice. And the more they watched 3I/Atlas, the more it felt like choice. If you wanted to remain unseen, you could. You would drift exactly as a comet should drift. You would outgas in ratios close enough to normal that no one could say for sure. You would never pulse too perfectly, never deviate too much, always enough randomness to pass as natural, always enough shadow to hide. But if you wanted to be noticed, not fully, not directly, just noticed, then you would do exactly what it did. Small hesitations, faint patterns, rhythms that could be dismissed but not forgotten. And that made people wonder, what if the silence is the message? Because communication does not always begin with words. Sometimes it begins with presence. Sometimes it begins with restraint. The kind of restraint that says, we are here, but we are not ready, or you are not ready, or maybe no one is ever ready. It is a strange thing to look into the void and feel watched, to study rock and gas and feel the weight of attention pressing back. Not hostile, not kind, just there, a pressure like gravity that does not care if you believe in it or not. The public wanted answers, always. They wanted the scientists to declare yes or no, alien or natural, machine or stone. But the scientists only said, maybe, perhaps, unusual, anomalous, and every cautious word became fuel for the imagination, and imagination filled the silence with stories. Some said it was a warning, that silence was how a parent watches a child near fire, that the object was a sentinel sent to measure whether we had grown dangerous enough to notice that if we acted recklessly, if we shouted too loudly, if we sent too much toward it, then maybe the silence would end not in words but in consequences. Others said it was patience, that it was waiting for us to reach a certain level to prove we could interpret, to prove we could see more than coincidence, to prove we could sit in the silence and not collapse into noise. And some said the silence itself was language, that every pause was deliberate, that absence was information, that what mattered was not the data we thought we saw, but the restraint of what was not there, a silence more profound than any sound. Governments grew nervous, not because they believed, but because people believed, and belief is power. Belief moves markets. Belief makes crowds restless. So committees met, quietly, behind closed doors, not to study the comet, but to study us, our reactions, our behavior, how long we could sit with silence before inventing answers too dangerous to contain. Because what if people acted on those answers? What if they declared contact had already happened? What if they decided the silence meant judgment, or salvation, or doom? Silence can be a weapon, and maybe that's why it frightened them most of all. The object itself could do nothing. It was too far, too small, too fragile to threaten us. But the silence it carried could unravel us from within. In late-night meetings, someone asked the question that hung unspoken in every room. What if silence is how first contact always begins? Because if you are cautious, if you are ancient, if you have crossed light years to arrive in someone else's home, you do not start with noise. You start with quiet. You watch. You listen. You learn. You let them show themselves in the way they fill the silence. And we were filling it with stories, with fear, with wonder, with a hunger so deep it echoed back at us, louder than any transmission. Perhaps that was the real test. Perhaps it had nothing to do with telescopes or radio waves. Perhaps it had everything to do with how we handled not knowing, because that is the hardest thing for us to not know. To sit in silence without breaking it, to accept mystery without forcing it into answers too small for its shape. And maybe that's why the silence was on purpose. Not to hide, not to taunt, but to teach. Because in silence, you see yourself more clearly than in any echo. And as 3I/Atlas drifted closer, day by day, the silence grew louder. People asked, will it break? Will it reveal? Will it speak? But maybe it already had. Maybe silence was the only language it needed. Governments denied it was alien. Of course they did. That is always the first move: denial, classification, reduction into technical phrases that numb the edges of awe, anomalous non-gravitational acceleration, thermal outgassing, carbon monoxide sublimation, each word a cage designed to trap wonder and drain it of teeth. But outside the walls of policy and protocol, the public did not stop. They could not. Because silence feeds imagination more than answers ever could. And soon the object was no longer just 3I/ATL. It was the visitor, the watcher, the messenger, names whispered across message, boards and headlines, names that gave it personality when silence would not. Religions stirred first. Some saw it as omen, a sign that judgment drew near. Preachers leaned on pulpits and warned that heaven was sending warnings in stone and ice. Others saw it as promise, a herald of redemption, proof that creation was wider and kinder than they had ever dared to dream. Scientists tried to calm it, tried to remind the world that comets come and go, that strange does not mean alive, that silence is silence, but their caution only fueled suspicion. For in the absence of certainty, every caution sounds like conspiracy. Every maybe becomes a cover-up. Every careful word becomes evidence of something bigger hidden behind closed doors. Conspiracy theories spread like fire in dry grass. Some said the governments had already decoded transmissions, that the signals were clear but suppressed. Some said the comet would not pass harmlessly, but rendezvous with hidden ships waiting in the shadow of Jupiter. Others said it was no comet at all, but a fragment of a Dyson swarm, a shard of technology drifting loose from an ancient civilization, whose scale we could not imagine. And though scientists sighed and shook their heads, in private even they could not stop the whisper. Because what if silence itself is the transmission? It became a contest of interpretations, one side saying nothing to see here, another saying everything to see. But both sides staring anyway, both sides unable to look away. The object swelled in the night sky, still faint but visible to amateurs. Now, small telescopes picked it up as a blur of light trailing a faint tail. Ordinary people saw it with their own eyes, and something inside shifted, because seeing is different than reading. Seeing makes it real. And when something becomes real, belief grows teeth. Communities formed around the comet, online first but then in physical spaces, watching parties on rooftops, vigils in fields, chants whispered into the night sky as though silence above might hear. Humans are not built to wait quietly. They ritualize their waiting. They turn mystery into meaning. They create communion where none was asked for. And so governments grew uneasy, not because the comet itself posed a threat, but because silence was bending humanity in unpredictable directions. Markets wavered, movements rose, protests called for transparency about what astronomers had really found. Petitions demanded the United Nations open official channels of communication to whatever intelligence might be hidden in stone and ice. One nation announced it had already broadcast greetings in binary, in music, in images encoded into radio waves. Another condemned the act as reckless, shouting into the dark where you do not know what listens. A debate that mirrored itself across dinner tables and classrooms. Should we speak first or wait? Should we dare noise or honor silence? And under all of it, the object moved silent as ever, unbothered by human noise, a fragment of something greater sliding toward the sun. Astronomers noted subtle changes, shifts in tail composition, flickers of brightness at intervals that nagged at pattern-finding minds. Was it coincidence? Was it noise? Or was it dialogue at scales we did not yet understand? One group insisted it was mirroring Earth's broadcasts back at us in chemical breath, a delayed echo, not voice but reflection. Another said nonsense, random alignments, our minds making music where there was only wind, but the argument only made the silence deeper. And deeper still was the question, what if it knows us now? What if by staring we have been seen? What if attention is itself the signal? Because humans reveal themselves when they believe they are observed, nations act differently when watched. People behave differently when seen. What if the comet was only a mirror, a test to make us look at ourselves? And what we saw was fear, longing, suspicion, hope, contradiction piled upon contradiction, until silence became a canvas, smeared with every color of human imagination. Governments plotted responses they would never admit. Satellites turned toward the object, with instruments not built for astronomy but for surveillance. Probes were quietly redirected to adjust trajectories for possible intercepts. Years down the line, contingency plans drafted in rooms without windows. But none of it could match the power of the collective imagination swelling across billions of minds, because belief spreads faster than policy. And once belief takes root, it changes everything. A comet became a question, and the question became a mirror, and the mirror showed us not stars but ourselves. And still it drifted closer, closer. Some nights it almost seemed brighter than the stars around it, a smudge that should not be a light that refused to explain itself. And silence pressed heavier than any words. It was nearing perihelion, now the closest point to the sun, the moment of heat and light where comets reveal their innermost selves, where frozen cores crack open and gases stream outward like breath. Finally exhaled after eons of silence, astronomers waited for this moment with hunger and dread, because perihelion meant answers, or at least more data, and more data meant the chance to test whether silence was only silence or something else. Governments had already prepared statements, carefully crafted phrases that could be deployed no matter what happened. If the comet brightened spectacularly, they would call it natural. If it fractured into strange geometries, they would call it coincidental. If it changed course, even then, words would be found to explain away what eyes could not. But the world was watching now with its own eyes, not just instruments. And eyes do not care for technicalities. Eyes care for wonder. On rooftops in cities, in deserts where the air was dry and dark, on ships rolling on black oceans, humanity tilted its gaze upward, waiting not for equations but for revelation. And in the nights before perihelion, something strange happened. Reports came of flashes, faint glimmers from the tail that did not fit predictions. Pulses of brightness that repeated over hours. Some saw nothing, others swore they saw everything. Arguments raged, data conflicted, But in the middle of confusion, one truth remained. People believed they had seen it speak. And that was enough. A broadcast erupted across networks, not from governments, but from collectives of ordinary people who had decided silence was no longer acceptable. They transmitted greetings encoded into radio and laser messages written in mathematics, in art, in voices of children reciting words of peace. They pointed their beams into the sky and aimed at the arc of 3I/Attilas as though trying to pierce silence with human longing. Astronomers warned against it. Some shouted recklessness, some pleaded for patience, but their voices were drowned beneath the tide of noise. Because silence is hard and noise is easy. And once the noise began, it could not be stopped. From every continent beams rose, not synchronized, not coordinated, but overlapping in chaos, greetings in hundreds of languages, prime numbers and musical scales, poetry encoded into binary, laughter and static, prayers and curses, a flood of humanity hurled upward in defiance of silence. Governments condemned, but some secretly joined, because no one wanted to be left behind if silence did break. No one wanted to risk being the only ones not to answer, if an answer finally came. And so the sky filled with whispers, and 3I/Attilas sailed onward, indifferent or listening. No one could say. Then came perihelion. The comet flared as comets do, gas and dust bursting outward in arcs of light. But there was something strange, something that silenced even the skeptics for a heartbeat. The jets were not random. They came in sequence, bursts from different points of the nucleus, timed with eerie precision, as though the comet itself were spinning a pattern into sunlight. Bursts separated by intervals that did not match rotation models, bursts that repeated not once but 3 times, 3 cycles that left no doubt for those already half convinced. To many, it was language. To others, coincidence, stacked upon coincidence until disbelief cracked. The debate exploded. Every scientist pulled into the storm. Some demanded restraint. Others admitted the timing was impossible to dismiss. One called it the closest thing to communication we had ever seen from the stars. Another called it mass delusion amplified by expectation. But outside academia, the conclusion had already been made. It was speaking. Crowds erupted into cheers across rooftops where people had gathered, social feeds lit like wildfire. The visitor has spoken, the watcher has answered, the messenger has sung, and in that rush of belief the world trembled. Markets plunged as fear spread. That contact meant consequence. Religions fractured between those who saw salvation and those who saw judgment. Protests erupted, demanding full disclosure of every scrap of government data, while others demanded we stop transmitting before we invited doom. The silence was broken now, not by the comet, but by us. And perhaps that was the point all along. For even if the pattern was chance, even if the jets were nothing more than thermal cracks in ice, the meaning was no longer up to the comet. It was up to us. We had decided it was speaking, and that decision reshaped everything. Scientists argued until their voices broke, but they could not put the silence back. Once you believe you have been spoken to, you can never return to believing you are alone. And so the question shifted. No longer was it, is it alive? Is it alien? Is it machine? Now the question was, what do we do with belief? Because belief builds empires. Belief topples them. Belief changes how billions live and die. And belief was now entwined with a rock of ice racing around the sun. And the silence that followed the bursts was louder than ever before. After perihelion, the object began its long retreat, slipping outward, away from the furnace of the sun, back toward the dark, back toward the silence. Its tail thinned, its brightness ebbed, and the world was left with the aftertaste of wonder that felt almost like grief. Because we had believed for a moment, maybe longer than a moment, that we had been spoken to, And once you believe you have heard something, silence after feels heavier than silence before. It is the same with a voice cut off mid-sentence. The absence feels like meaning, the pause grows into presence, and so as 3I/Attilas dimmed, people began to fill that dimming with stories again. Some said the bursts at perihelion had been greeting, that the silence now was simply rest, a cycle complete, a message already given. Others said it had been test, and we had failed, our chaos of signals proving immaturity, our impatience proving unreadiness. And still others whispered that it had never been for us at all, that perihelion was when it opened its throat to speak to others like it, to send its pulse outward in directions we could not follow, that we had only overheard, like children pressing ears to a wall where adults speak in, rooms beyond reach. Governments pressed harder to control the narrative. Now the risk of panic too high, the risk of chaos too sharp. Statements were released calling the perihelion bursts natural, entirely explainable, predictable once new models were applied. But the words fell flat because they came too late. Belief does not bow to equations. Once wonder roots itself, it resists pruning. And so movements grew. One called themselves the listeners, devoted to recording every flicker of the comet's light until it vanished, convinced the silence itself would eventually reveal pattern, convinced that persistence was the only language 3I/Attilas respected. Another called themselves the senders, determined to continue broadcasting until answer came. They pointed dishes skyward night after night, their messages carrying not only mathematics but also songs, art, voices, confessions whispered into binary streams that they believed would be caught by something beyond ice. And a darker faction too. The watchmen, who warned against provocation, who feared that our noise was reckless, who claimed silence was warning not invitation. They worked to jam transmissions, to sabotage broadcasts, to protect humanity not from impact but from notice. 3 responses to silence: listen, speak, fear, and humanity divided itself accordingly. But the comet itself gave no answer. It only drifted farther now, dimmer, until amateurs could no longer see it with naked eye, until only instruments could track the faint smudge against starfields. And the silence grew thicker. Some scientists confessed quietly that they missed it, that their lives had been consumed by its mystery for months, and without it, there was emptiness, a hollow echo in the night sky where once wonder had burned. But others said no, this is only beginning, because the true change was not in the sky but in us. For we had imagined ourselves into contact, and imagination does not retreat so easily. Philosophers wrote that whether alien or not, whether life or ice, the comet had become first contact, because it had changed how we see ourselves, because now when we look outward, we do not see emptiness but possibility, and that shift cannot be undone. The question lingered: what if it had been test? What if it was waiting for us to follow? Proposals rose in agencies, plans to send probes, fast intercept missions that might launch in years, not decades. The comet was fading, but its trajectory mapped. Perhaps a mission could chase it. Perhaps we could touch what silence would not yield. Debates tore through halls of power. Some argued we must go, we must know. Others warned it was too dangerous, that chasing silence might wake something better left asleep. And outside those halls, ordinary people argued the same, on streets, in cafes, in bedrooms, lit by screens at midnight. Humanity arguing with itself as though the comet had placed a mirror in orbit and asked us to choose what reflection we wanted to carry forward. And always the silence. At times it felt mocking, at times patient, at times like a wound that would not heal. And still, it moved outward, away, always away. And humans do not endure loss easily. So some began to whisper of building our own messengers, our own 3I/Attilas, Objects we could fling into the dark, carrying our words, our signals carved into metal and crystal, artifacts that might one day drift into the skies of others, and fill their silence with our presence. If silence was language, then we too could speak it. Not with noise, not with radio, but with drift itself. And perhaps that was the legacy of first contact. Not confirmation, not answer, but transformation, a shift from waiting to acting, from listening to becoming. Because once silence enters you, it does not leave. And 3I/Atlas, whether alive or dead, whether messenger or stone, had filled humanity with silence that no explanation could erase. And so, as it dimmed beyond sight, as it vanished into the archives of telescopes, it did not vanish at all. It remained in us. Because the truth is, first contact does not need words. It does not need answers. It only needs change. And we had already changed. It was gone from most skies now, no longer a smudge for the naked eye, no longer the bright whisper that stirred rooftops into vigils and children into pointing fingers. Only instruments could see it. Long exposures pulling faint trails across star fields, data streams dwindling into numbers that felt like echoes more than presence. And yet its absence was louder than its presence had ever been. The world does not forget so quickly, especially not when silence has burned itself into every conversation, every argument, every dream. Movements that rose while it flared did not vanish when it faded. The listeners grew more devout, convinced that silence itself was still message. They pored over terabytes of faint light curves, searching for signals in the noise. They met in quiet rooms with screens glowing faintly on, their faces like altar light. They treated every flicker as scripture. The senders grew louder, building bigger transmitters, pooling resources across continents, crowdfunding dishes in deserts, improvising arrays from backyard hardware. Each beam pointed outward into the night, carrying messages layered with desperation and hope, voices stacked like prayer, towers of binary and radio. They believed that to stop speaking would be betrayal, that silence was not patience but demand, that we had been asked and we must answer. The watchmen hardened too, sabotaging where they could, jamming frequencies, leaking warnings into the public sphere, declaring that every transmission was bait thrown into waters where sharks may swim. They saw danger not in the comet itself but in us, in our inability to endure silence without filling it with noise. And so humanity split into 3 tribes. Listen, speak, fear, but beneath the surface another division grew. Those who wanted to chase and those who wanted to wait. Because the comet might fade from sight, but its trajectory was known, its course mapped, a road into the dark traced across the stars, and some argued that we could follow, that we should. Plans emerged from agencies and universities, proposals drafted in fevered nights, spacecraft faster than anything built before, slingshot maneuvers around planets to build velocity, enough to catch a visitor fleeing into the void, intercept missions that could take decades, but would at last put metal and eyes close enough to know. But the counter-argument was strong. To chase silence is to risk becoming part of it. To follow into dark is to vanish into dark. Money would be poured, generations would wait. And when the probe arrived, perhaps there would be nothing but rock after all. Nothing but dust and absence and the hollow laugh of entropy. And so committees argued, panels assembled, budgets bent beneath pressure. But while governments hesitated, private ventures rose, billionaires announcing contests, consortia of engineers promising intercept craft in years, not decades. Humanity, impatient as always, unwilling to watch silence slip beyond reach without flinging something after it. But behind the technical debates lurked questions older than science, questions of fear, questions of myth. Because to chase was to admit belief, to wait was to admit doubt. And neither position was safe. Religions fractured deeper still. Some declared the fading was proof the comet had been an angelic messenger departing after delivering warning. Others claimed it was trickster, testing our faith. Still others declared it was harbinger of apocalypse, and its retreat meant only a lull before return. And ordinary people, billions who did not read equations or track telescopes, they felt it as absence in their daily sky, a missing brightness, a hole, and absence breeds story. Books surged onto shelves, films into theatres, songs onto radios, each weaving silence into metaphor. Lovers whispering about 3I/Atlas, as though it were lost romance. Protesters invoking it as symbol of betrayal by governments. Dreamers carving it into murals as guide star for a future unchained from Earth. The comet was not in the sky, but it was everywhere else. And scientists themselves, some hardened further, insisting all anomaly was error, coincidence, flawed models. Others began to soften, to confess quietly over drinks that the object still haunted them, that sometimes in their calculations they glimpsed patterns that refused to dissolve, that sometimes in their dreams the comet returned and hovered above Earth unmoving, as though waiting for us to speak clearly. And all the while, silence thickened, because silence after noise feels heavier than silence before. We had shouted, we had sent our voices into the void, and nothing came back. And the nothing became unbearable. So the senders doubled their effort, saturating the sky with messages. Desperate, now some rational, some chaotic, cries of entire nations layered into beams of light. But the silence that returned was unbroken. And some began to fear, not that the comet was gone, but that it was listening still, and choosing not to answer, because rejection hurts more than absence. And whispers spread. Maybe it had judged us unworthy. Maybe it had already spoken to others and found us lacking. Maybe silence itself was the verdict. And fear twisted belief into shadow. Riots flared in some cities. Temples burned in others, while elsewhere communities gathered tighter, building sanctuaries where they waited for return. Humanity fracturing in every direction under the weight of silence. And the comet drifted outward, always outward, beyond reach of most eyes, now but closer than ever in imagination. It is strange how something leaving can feel more present than when it arrived. But that is the nature of silence. It echoes, it lingers, it grows, and humanity could not let it go. The first serious proposal to chase it was unveiled not in a government hall, not in some agency's sterile press room, but in a crowded auditorium where engineers and dreamers pooled their visions together into a promise, a spacecraft small enough to build quickly but fast enough to catch what was already fleeing into the dark. They called it a pursuit mission, but in whispers people called it a pilgrimage, because it was not just science anymore, it was devotion. The idea was simple in mathematics but immense in practice. To build a probe light enough to be accelerated by gravity assists, to slingshot around planets, to ride the curves of orbits until its speed built higher than any human craft before it, and then to hurl it outward along the trail of 3I/Atlas. Decades would pass before intercept. The comet was already receding, already dimming, but trajectories were calculable if launched soon. If resources poured in, the machine could still reach it in human lifetime. Governments hesitated. The cost was immense. The timeline long, and beneath hesitation was fear. Fear of what might be found if silence broke into something undeniable. But the private consortium pressed on, billionaires funding contests, universities aligning behind blueprints, students volunteering sleepless nights to draft components. It felt less like project and more like crusade. And once whispers of the pursuit spread, the world fractured further. The listeners saw it as betrayal, that chasing would shatter the purity of silence, that we must remain still until 3I/Atlas chose to speak again. They condemned the mission as arrogance. Human noise made metal. The senders cheered it. declaring the probe would be messenger of our persistence, a demonstration that silence would not silence us, that we would follow into darkness until dialogue came. And the watchman condemned it utterly. To chase was provocation, to follow was invitation to doom. They warned that pursuit would trigger response, not mercy, that what lurked in silence would not welcome our footsteps. And humanity tore itself along those lines. Arguments in homes, debates in parliaments, protests in streets where banners of "chase it and let it go" clashed like armies of belief. But still, the engineers built, because belief with funding is unstoppable. Pieces of the probe took shape in hangars, sleek shells of alloy designed for speed, not comfort, instruments sharpened to taste faint gases and scan crystalline structures, cameras built to pierce dark where stars grow thin, every component a prayer in metal, every bolt turned a confession of longing. Children visited factories and touched the machine as though it were relic. Old men wept seeing its body assembled. It became more than technology. It became embodiment of hunger. But still governments worried. Still committees stalled. Still voices of caution whispered that silence is warning, not invitation. And through it all, 3I/8LS drifted outward, silent, patient, vanishing further into the black. Yet absent sharpened desire. Scientists argued with fiercer voices. Now, some claiming perihelion bursts were coincidence proven by new models, others insisting no model could erase the rhythm. Some said chasing was folly, others said not chasing was cowardice. And in that tension humanity revealed itself, because perhaps the comet had never been alien at all. Perhaps it was only mirror. Perhaps silence was not communication, but reflection. Perhaps we were only ever speaking to ourselves. But speaking changes us nonetheless. The launch date approached. Scaffolds lifted, engines tested, simulations ran, and the world held its breath. Would we really do it? Would we fling metal after silence? Would we commit decades and generations to pursuit of an answer that might never come? And the answer was yes, because we could not do it. Because silence once broken cannot be restored. And the day of launch dawned with crowds gathered across continents, not because they understood trajectories, but because they understood longing. The rocket roared into sky, carrying with it every contradiction of humanity: fear, hope, arrogance, humility, desire, dread. And as fire faded and the probe slipped into black, the world erupted into noise. Cheers and prayers and curses, all tangled together. We had chased silence. We had taken step from which there was no return. And in that step, the world changed again. For whether 3I/8LS was alive or dead, whether it was messenger or rock, the choice to follow was irreversible confession. We had admitted to ourselves what we could no longer deny, that silence was not enough, that we needed to know, and so the probe sailed outward, engines spent, momentum carrying it faster than any human craft before a sliver of air, wraithing into dark after an object that might never turn to greet it. And on Earth, the debates only deepened. Because once you chase silence, you must live with the question, what if it answers? And what if it does not? Years passed after launch, and the probe became more than machine. It became myth. Children who had watched fire rise into sky grew into adults with its image burned into memory. They told stories of the pursuit as though it were pilgrimage, as though metal chasing silence were act of faith rather than science. And in schools across continents, students pointed to star maps where the path of 3I/8LAS was traced, and teachers explained that one day, far away, the probe would reach it, and children asked the question. Adults did not dare ask aloud, what if something answers before then? The world settled into rhythms of waiting. But waiting is not stillness. Waiting transforms. The listeners kept their vigil, eyes pressed to instruments, recording every faint photon. Some claimed to see shifts, still rhythms hidden in fading trails. Most saw only noise. But devotion does not require proof. Devotion only requires persistence. The senders grew ever louder. Not satisfied with single launch, they began plans for more, faster craft, brighter beams. Some pointed not at 3I/ATLS, but at other stars entirely. Deciding silence had been invitation, not from one object, but from universe itself. And so their messages, scattered across the heavens like seeds flung into endless soil, the watchmen hardened into secrecy. They no longer shouted only warnings. They built shadows, programs designed to mask transmissions, to jam arrays, to intercept satellites. Convinced that our hunger would bring ruin if not restrained, they began to move in hidden networks, convinced they were humanity's last defense against itself. 3 tribes still, but more entrenched, more divided, more unwilling to yield. And governments walked fine line between them, funding research but denying belief, supporting pursuit but condemning noise, balancing on knife-sep's edge between wonder and fear. The comet itself grew fainter still, instruments straining to hold its smudge against starfields, telescopes capturing fewer photons each year, until for most it became only memory. But memory can burn brighter than sight. And humanity did not forget. The pursuit probe continued outward, silent, relentless. Each update from it celebrated like communion. Bursts of data streamed back across billions of kilometers, numbers translated into graphs, into faint whispers of dark between stars. No sign yet of 3I/Atlas. Too far still, but trajectory steady, confidence strong. Decades stretched ahead before intercept, and yet it already felt alive in collective imagination, as though the probe itself were extension of us, a limb reaching into void where our bodies could not go. And in its shadow humanity shifted again. Young generations who had grown under silence began to think differently than those before. For them the universe was not empty. For them the idea of being watched was not strange, but given they spoke casually of others beyond Earth, not as fantasy but as inevitability. Art changed, literature shifted, songs carried themes of waiting and pursuit, even architecture bent towards celestial motifs. Humanity's seps culture reshaped by comet. It could no longer see but could not forget. And in science, doors opened. New projects born from hunger to know, telescopes larger than mountains built to scan skies for more wanderers, detectors, straining for faint signs in noise. Not just 3I/Atlas now, but all space became canvas of possibility. And they found more, not alive, not strange, but still more, interstellar objects drifting through, like visitors unnoticed before rocks from other stars. Reminders that we are not isolated, that pieces of distant systems cross paths with ours more often than we believed. And each new discovery carried whisper, could this one too be alive? Could this one too carry silence with purpose? Skeptics groaned, but believers smiled, because silence had already taught them lesson. Once you imagine presence, you see it everywhere. And the debates grew older, but not quieter. Some began to say the pursuit probe was a mistake, that we had wasted decades chasing ghosts. Others said it was humanity SIP's greatest achievement, proof we could act together, even when silence gave nothing back. And still it sailed farther faster, across void where light itself takes years to travel. Until one day, faint update returned, not discovery, not revelation, only silence. The probe had passed into region where transmissions grew weaker, where distance stretched communication to thin whispers, ground stations strained to catch fragments, sentences broken by cosmic static, and humanity held its breath again, remembering how silence had begun, fearing that silence had returned. But faint signals continued, weaker, but still there, still proof that pursuit remained alive. And so waiting stretched longer still. Generations turned, parents who had seen launch now old, children born into silence, now adults raising their own, and through it all the comet remained myth in absence, while the probe carried humanity's Sep's patience into dark, and perhaps that was first contact after all, not with alien, but with silence itself, because silence had forced us to chase, to build, to dream beyond lifetimes, to act in ways that stretched past fear of futility. Silence had changed us more than any voice could have. And somewhere out there, ahead of a probe still years away, a comet drifted, carrying mystery no explanation could erase. The years folded into decades, and the comet was gone from human eyes, but not from human thought. It lingered like ghost at the edge of consciousness, shaping choices long after its light had faded. The pursuit probe pressed on, slipping into deeper dark, its instruments alive, but whispering now, signals stretched thin by distance, delayed by hours, then by days. Each update treasured like relic, each packet of data celebrated as heartbeat from child sent into wilderness. But as decades passed, something strange happened. The world changed around the probe, changed faster than it traveled. By the time it had crossed half the distance, Earth itself was no longer the same planet that had launched it. New technologies had bloomed, propulsion systems, once only dreamed, began to take form, fusion drives tested in orbit, light sails pushed by beams from Earth, whispers of antimatter research stirring into plans. Suddenly the probe that had been fastest of its time was relic, a patient runner soon to be outpaced by sprinters not yet born when it left. And this raised the question no one wanted to face. What if the comet no longer mattered? For when silence lingers too long, desire shifts, attention wanders, new mysteries rise. And humanity, restless as always, began to wonder if chasing one object was mistake, if we should instead scatter our reach outward in every direction, not pursuit of one silence, but of all silence. Telescopes mapped thousands of new candidates, objects slipping through from interstellar space, debris from stars we would never see with naked eye, each one whispering possibility, each one threatening to replace the myth of 3I/Attilas with new stories. And yet, the comet remained different, because it had been first, because its silence had been sharpest, because its perihelion bursts had planted root too deep to pull. But as new technologies rose, factions grew louder again. Some demanded second pursuit, faster craft built with new engines, capable of catching 3I/ATLAS in years, not decades. Why wait for probe crawling through void when leap could be made now? Others said, no, we must scatter wide, chase not one but many, spread ourselves across dark like net and see what we draw back. And still others, the watchmen older now but not weaker, said none of this should be, that the more we chase the more we reveal ourselves, that silence is trap, and we are walking willingly into teeth. And arguments raged again, as they always did. But while humanity argued, time did what it always does. It passed. The first pursuit probe crossed threshold where faint signals barely reached. Updates became irregular. Gaps stretched into months, then years. Each time data returned, people celebrated as miracle, but each time celebration carried shadow. Will this be last? And when 1 year turned into 2 without reply, grief rippled through the world. Some said the probe was dead, lost in void, swallowed by entropy. Others said no, it still lives. Silence does not mean death. Silence is its own kind of life. And humanity found itself back where it began, staring at silence and filling it with stories. But now, silence was not comet. Silence was our own creation, our own machine vanishing into dark. And that perhaps was lesson deeper than any other. That even when we build, when we fling metal into void, when we chase mystery with our own hands, silence remains. Because silence is not theirs. Silence is universe itself. and universes patient beyond comprehension. But not all were willing to wait again. With new engines tested, new crafts ready, second mission prepared, this time faster, stronger, designed not only to reach but to linger, to orbit comet if found, to taste its gases, to pierce its surface with drills and sensors, to answer once and for all. And when proposal surfaced, world divided again. Some cheered, second chance, better chance. Others groaned, more noise, more arrogance. But decision came, and second probe prepared, because humanity cannot resist silence forever. And so once again fire roared into sky, and once again crowds gathered, and once again metal raced outward after ghost. But this time the world was different, because now silence was not surprise, it was expectation. And expectation reshapes everything. The second probe was born in an age already different from the first. The world had grown restless, impatient, unwilling to live with silence that stretched too far into memory. It was not a single nation that built it, but a coalition of necessity. Corporations with more reach than governments, agencies pooling resources they once would have hoarded, engineers scattered across continents linked by fiber and light, humanity bound together not by agreement but by obsession. This craft was not pilgrim but hunter, designed not just to follow but to catch, to overtake the first probe, to close the gap between Earth and comet faster than any machine before it. Its sails were thin as whispers, unfolding in orbit like petals of metal light, pushed not by wind but by beams from Earth and Moon, lasers feeding it with momentum until it slipped free into dark. And when it left, there was less awe than before, less trembling wonder, because now silence was familiar, now pursuit was routine, now humanity expected to chase. But expectation itself was transformation, because a species that expects to chase silence is no longer the same as one that waits. The second probe carried more than instruments. It carried memory, etched into panels were voices from billions, not images of Earth as with Voyager, not simple greetings but confessions, songs of despair, cries of longing, questions without answers, because humanity had learned from silence. And silence is not broken by pride, but by vulnerability. And so the probe carried not who we thought we were, but who we feared we might be. And for many this was more terrifying than contact. Because what if something read it? What if silence was pierced not by us learning them, but them learning us? And still it sailed. And behind it on Earth, the debates sharpened. The listeners whispered that chasing again was desecration, that silence had been gift squandered by noise. They withdrew further into monasteries of observation, eyes fixed on stars with patient devotion, waiting for meaning to rise unbidden from absence. The senders rejoiced, their ideology now embodied in metal flying. Faster than any human thing, they called it proof that persistence is answer, that we must never stop shouting until void itself replies. The watchmen seethed, convinced that second chase was final step toward doom. They whispered of sabotage, of striking not at probe but at beams that fed it, at stations that guided it, convinced that to cut chain was only way to save humanity from its hunger. And society strained beneath these divisions. But the comet, still, it drifted outward, silent. By now it was far beyond eyes of amateurs. Even great telescopes strained to glimpse it. Only faint predictions traced its path, a ghost among stars. But myth does not fade with distance. Myth only grows. And so 3I/Atlas was no longer comet, no longer stone, no longer ice. It was symbol. To some it was promise. To others it was threat. To all it was mirror. And mirrors never leave us unchanged. Decades turned again. Technology rose higher. Whispers of crewed missions to outer planets grew into plans. Humanity stretched farther into its own system than ever before. And yet, in every conversation of exploration, comet lingered like shadow at edge, because to chase planets is science, to chase stars is dream, but to chase comet is confession. Confession that silence still rules us. Confession that first contact already happened, even if only in imagination. And imagination is as real as stone when enough believe. The second probe sailed, surpassing speeds once thought impossible, closing gap year by year, and humanity watched, not with wonder now, but with expectation. Updates stream not into awe but into routine. But sometimes, at night, when children asked what happens if it finds something, parents had no answer, and silence filled homes again. Because that is truth of silence. It always returns, no matter how fast we chase, no matter how far we fling ourselves, silence waits ahead, and comet waits within it. Time pressed forward as it always does, indifferent to our urgency, and the second probe became another line on charts, another streak across the dark, faster than anything we had ever launched before, yet still unbearably slow compared to hunger inside us. For hunger grows when silence deepens, and silence had been with us so long now that it shaped generations. Children born after the first probe no longer remembered its launch. For them it was ancient story told by grandparents, a tale wrapped in fading images of fire rising into sky, an event blurred with myth. And when they spoke of it, it was not science but legend. The second probe felt different. It was present, real, its progress tracked live, its data streamed like heartbeat, its presence part of daily news cycle. But that presence carried new weight, because unlike first, this probe was not symbol of waiting, it was symbol of demand. We demanded answers now. And yet, space does not bend for demand. The comet still lay decades ahead, drifting in silence no matter how we chased, and the longer we chased, the more we changed. The listeners had become almost monastic, entire observatories converted into cloisters where silence was worshipped not as absence but as presence. They whispered that the true contact had already occurred, that silence itself was the message, that pursuit was refusal to hear what had already been said. The senders became louder still, their beams brighter, their transmissions more extravagant, no longer just radio but bursts of directed energy, pulses of mathematics flung like spears across the galaxy. They said silence was void, waiting to be filled, and we were duty-bound to fill it. The watchmen meanwhile grew shadows deeper, their networks more secretive, sabotage, now confirmed though never admitted, satellites failing under mysterious circumstances, beams flickering out at crucial hours, whispers of interference at the highest levels, their creed simple: the less we say, the longer we live. And the rest of humanity, caught between, weary of argument, yet unable to ignore it. Silence does not divide easily. It fractures into wounds, and wounds fester. The probe pressed on nonetheless, each update celebrated, each burst of data analyzed for hint of anomaly, and sometimes anomalies did come, strange readings, spikes of radiation, flickers of unexpected particles, nothing definitive, nothing more than noise. Yet every spike ignited frenzy. Was it comet? Was it answer? Was it only instrument fatigue? And each disappointment carved deeper impatience, until whispers began. What if when probe arrives, comet is gone? What if when probe arrives, there is nothing at all? What if silence is all there ever was? And that thought terrified more than alien ever could. Because if silence was all, then all our hunger, all our waiting, all our longing had been for nothing. And humanity cannot bear nothing. So art turned darker, stories more haunted, films painted futures where silence consumed everything, where probes drifted forever into void without return, where humans spoke louder and louder until their voices dissolved into emptiness. It was not comet that frightened us anymore. It was silence itself, And yet, some few found peace there, found comfort in thought that universe owed us nothing, that silence was not rejection but simple truth, that meaning is what we create, not what we receive. But such voices were drowned beneath roar of hunger. Governments struggled too, for funding missions that would not return results within lifetimes, tested patience of populations. Politicians wanted quick answers, immediate triumphs, yet Comet offered none. Still, probe sailed. Still, silence endured. And still, humanity wrestled with mirror Comet held before us. Because Comet had never spoken, and yet it had revealed us. It showed us we are restless, that we cannot wait, that we tear ourselves apart over what we cannot prove, that we chase not only knowledge but ghosts of ourselves. And perhaps that was its true gift. Not alien, not signal, not revelation, but reflection. But reflection cuts, because in it we see our desperation, our fragility, our terror that we are alone. And so we chase harder still, always harder, always deeper into silence. The comet was no longer just comet, it was tribunal, an unseen judge drifting through dark while humanity waited for verdict. No signal, no reply, no undeniable change in trajectory, only silence, yet silence was interpreted as judgment. Some whispered it was patience, others whispered it was disdain, still others said it was trap, but all agreed it was not neutral. Because nothing neutral could shape us so deeply. The probe pressed on decades to go, instruments humming their soft mechanical hymns, streams of data still trickling across gulf of black, but nothing new enough to soothe hunger. And hunger began to twist into fever. Artists painted Comet not as stone but as eye, watching always, unblinking, patient as predator or saint. Novels described societies collapsing under weight of waiting, religions grew around Comet seps, absence promising salvation or doom at its eventual unveiling. Every faction sharpened belief. Listeners claiming verdict had already been spoken in silence, that humanity was not yet worthy of voice. Senders declaring verdict would come only if we proved persistence by shouting louder than void. Watchmen warning verdict was already sealed against us if we did not stop, and ordinary people, exhausted, chose sides not because they believed, but because they were weary of uncertainty. Because silence is exhausting. It gnaws at bones, it carves grooves in thought, it demands interpretation even when none exists. And governments found themselves dragged deeper into chaos. Policies shaped not by science but by fear of losing public to one faction or another. Budgets bent, not by evidence but by need to appear decisive against silence that offered no ground to stand on. Meanwhile the probe sailed on, blind to politics, blind to belief, only momentum carrying it outward. Updates slowed as distance grew. Now hours turned to days, turned to weeks. Between signals, every whisper arriving on Earth, bent under static, every fragment of data dissected for hints that likely were nothing. And yet, people waited. And as they waited, silence became not absence but presence. It was in every conversation, in every law debated, in every broadcast. It became weather of human thought. And within that weather strange storms began. Groups of zealots formed declaring Comet divine, others declaring it demonic. Some said it was Ark carrying survivors of some older star. Some said it was weapon left adrift until provoked. Some said it was simply mirror designed to show us our own divisions. And violence flared where words failed. Protests turning to riots. Sabotage rumored but never proven. Nations accusing one another of hiding transmissions or falsifying data, paranoia blooming like fungus in darkness. And still Comet drifted on, indifferent, silent, judge that never lifted gavel. The strain spread into personal lives, marriages broke under pressure of disagreement, friendships fractured over belief in signal or denial of meaning. Families split between those who wanted louder pursuit and those who feared retribution. Because silence was not cosmic anymore. Silence was inside our homes, inside our minds, but not all was despair. Some found strange serenity, meditative acceptance. They claimed Comet had taught humanity patience, that waiting itself was dialogue, that first contact did not need words, only endurance. And though they were minority, their calmness was contagious. They formed communities that lived slower, that spoke less, that treated silence as holy ground. It was as though Comet had divided us into two species, one that shouted louder, one that learned to whisper, and between them, void widened. The second probe pressed faster. Now, beams from Earth and Moon feeding its sails with relentless energy. Progress accelerated beyond expectation. Predictions shifted, intercept closer than first imagined. And this only deepened fever. For now we had countdown. Now humanity knew that in years, not decades, truth would arrive. And nothing terrifies more than approaching answer. Because as long as question remains, imagination rules. But once answer comes, imagination dies. And so some prayed Comet would remain silent forever, others prayed it would roar. But all feared the end of waiting, because waiting had become identity. And to lose it would mean to lose ourselves. The countdown began quietly. A number whispered first in laboratories, then in reports, then in media, until soon every person alive knew it. The number of years before the second probe would reach 3I/Attilas. And that number became heartbeat of humanity. Governments marked it in calendars as though it were holiday. Doomsayers scrawled it on banners, as though it were warning. Children whispered it to one another in schools as though it were spell. Every passing year, the number dropped, and with it certainty grew heavier. We were no longer chasing endless void, no longer stretching hope across lifetimes without promise. Now there was deadline. Now there was moment approaching when silence must yield answer. And that knowledge twisted the world. Economies bent toward it. Industries restructured to support mission. Not just technology, but culture itself was engineered around anticipation. Movies counted down. Books aligned plots with numbers. Festivals rose, celebrating each reduction. But celebration carried edge of dread. Because to wait for answer is one thing, to know answer is coming is another. And humanity trembled beneath weight of certainty. The listeners retreated further into stillness, monasteries swelling with new recruits. Whole towns dedicated to lives of quiet. They claimed preparation must be inner, not outer, that when silence broke, only those who had learned to dwell in it would understand. The senders grew louder than ever. Transmissions doubled, then tripled. Beams of energy shot across void like fireworks. They said countdown was not to be feared, but embraced. That Comet would answer only if we proved ourselves impossible to ignore. And so they shouted into black with desperate joy. The watchmen became furious. Sabotage no longer whispered but declared. They hacked beams. They silenced satellites. They attacked launch sites of smaller missions, convinced the countdown was not blessing but death sentence, that the closer probe drew, the closer we came to awakening. Predator. And governments fractured beneath pressure, some siding with listeners and building sanctuaries of silence, others with senders pouring resources into beacons, others with watchmen cracking down on transmissions, humanity splintering into civilizations, aligned not by geography but by philosophy of silence. And in the cracks, new faiths blossomed. Some claimed Comet was Ark carrying ancestors, others claimed it was Judge sent to weigh our worth, still others claimed it was messenger of destruction and salvation, all united by conviction that Probe SIP's arrival would end age of waiting and begin something else entirely. And ordinary people, caught between extremes, learn to live with dread in daily lives, planning weddings and births and futures against backdrop of ticking clock, always wondering if those futures would survive the answer. The probe itself sailed on blind to hopes placed upon it. Only instruments steady, signals trickling back, each update analyzed as though it might contain revelation, but still only silence. And silence now was unbearable. Because silence so close to deadline feels heavier than silence at distance. It feels deliberate. It feels like breath held before word. And the world began to unravel. Conflicts ignited between factions, wars of ideology disguised as skirmishes over resources, rebellions in cities where senders and watchmen clashed in streets, cyber attacks crippling networks used to monitor mission, humanity turning on itself, not because of Comet, but because of reflection Comet forced us to see. And through it all, the number dropped lower. 10 years, 9, 8, each digit, a drumbeat of anxiety echoing across planet. And art grew stranger, music composed not to soothe but to mimic pulse of countdown literature, breaking into fragments designed to end mid-sentence as if waiting for Comet to finish thought. Architecture rising with spires pointing toward projected path. Everything became Comet. Everything became silence. And silence became unbearable. Some people fled into wilderness, abandoning technology to escape constant pulse of numbers. Others surrendered into digital illusions, living in simulations where Comet never existed, where silence never haunted. But most stayed, watching skies though Comet was invisible, eyes straining toward dark where myth drifted unseen. And as probe closed in, humanity asked question it had avoided for decades. What if the comet does nothing? What if probe arrives, instruments pierce ice and stone, and find only ice and stone? What if all of this, the wars, the faiths, the divisions, the longing, was built on nothing but rock? And that thought was unbearable, because even terror was preferable to emptiness. Better to be prey than to be alone. And so imagination filled silence once again. Some claimed probe would awaken Comet, some claimed Comet would awaken us, some claimed nothing would matter, because by then we would already be something else. And all of them feared and longed in equal measure, because countdown could not be stopped. Probe would arrive, Comet would answer or not, and world would never be same either way. 7 years, then 6, then 5. The number ticked downward like heartbeat too loud to ignore. Every human alive could feel it pounding beneath daily life. Every decision seemed weighed against it. Every hope and fear balanced on approaching moment when probe would meet comet in silent, dark. Nations once proud of independence found themselves bending inward. Economies twisted around singular obsession. No longer growth for growth's sake, but growth toward comet. Schools reshaped curricula to prepare children for world after answer. Art institutions framed their works as offerings for unknown witness. Entire generations raised beneath shadow of ticking clock. And society divided sharper than ever. The listeners withdrew almost completely from outside life. Vast observatories converted into living sanctuaries where silence was cultivated like sacred crop. Monks of absence rising before dawn to chart skies, speaking only in fragments, waiting for verdict they claimed was already given. In stillness, but would soon be proven to all. They said humanity must be humble, must learn patience, must greet comet with quiet hearts, not blazing transmissions. The senders, by contrast, reached fever pitch, their beams brighter than ever, their signals saturating skies with torrents of mathematics and music and confession. They spoke of comet as doorway, and insisted we must knock louder than void itself. They launched swarms of small transmitters into solar orbit, each one pulsing messages outward. They said, silence was not rejection but challenge, a puzzle demanding persistence, and so they roared across heavens with desperate joy. The watchmen became soldiers of paranoia, no longer content to sabotage quietly. They now declared themselves openly, entire states controlled by them. enforcing silence with harsh laws, banning transmissions, dismantling observatories, attacking those who dared beam into sky. Their doctrine absolute: to speak is to die. Only silence can save. And in between, billions caught in turbulence, families fractured by belief, marriages torn between factions, children raised in one doctrine only to rebel into another, holidays replaced with rituals of comet, prayers whispered to sky, not to gods but to silence itself. The probe sailed on, indifferent. Each update weaker now, stretched across gulf until only fragments arrived, bursts of numbers broken by static, instruments strained but steady, still no signal, still no anomaly that could not be explained as natural. Yet the very absence of anomaly became its own fuel for debate. For some said silence so close to contact was proof comet was dead stone. Others said silence so close was proof comet was alive, but waiting until last moment to reveal still. Others said silence was deliberate cruelty, test to see how we break beneath weight of waiting. And we were breaking. Wars ignited in borderlands, where watchman states clashed with sender coalitions. Cities burned, not because of comet, but because of what comet had come to mean. People murdered neighbors for shouting beams into sky, or for refusing to join in chorus, silence turning into blood. Yet, even amid chaos, culture thrived in strange ways. Music composed entirely of countdown rhythms, novels written as fragments awaiting final chapter comet would provide, architecture rising as spires aligned with projected trajectory, humanity turning fear into beauty, because we could do nothing else. And as 4 years became 3, tension sharpened into terror. Governments tried to prepare populations for possibility of nothing, tried to teach acceptance of emptiness. But no words could soothe, because decades of waiting had carved meaning too deep. Nothing was no longer option. Even emptiness would be interpreted. Even absence would be answer. And answer was terrifying. For if comet was nothing, then meaning was what we made, not what we found, and many could not bear that weight. Suicides rose, cults spread promising salvation through surrender before contact. Violence surged in cities where factions clashed, humanity spiraling under pressure of silence ticking toward end. Yet probe pressed on. 2 years, then 1, and with each passing month, world grew stranger. Some communities abandoned technology, completely retreating into forests or deserts, declaring comet sips answer irrelevant, claiming meaning must be built on Earth, not sought in sky. Others built vast screens in cities where every fragment of probe SIP's transmission would be broadcast live, preparing for moment when comet revealed itself to billions at once. And through it all, silence endured. The comet drifted still, invisible to most eyes, unseen judge drawing nearer in time, if not in distance, and humanity trembled as though awaiting execution or revelation. The probe sailed on. Months now, not years, and world held its breath so tightly it seemed lungs would burst, because soon silence would break, or silence would deepen forever. Either way, humanity would never be same. The final year arrived like a shadow stretching over every life. Every clock seemed to echo with the same rhythm, not hours or days but months remaining. The countdown no longer abstract. It was heartbeat of humanity. Every news broadcast began with it. Every conversation circled back to it. Calendars no longer tracked seasons but distance between probe and comet, and the number grew smaller each time people looked. Children born during the countdown were called children of silence. Their births marked not only by weight and length, but by how many months until answer. Families whispered lullabies that included the number, as if preparing their infants for a world that might end in revelation or in emptiness. And with each week passing, tension sharpened. Governments organized global councils not to rule but to manage expectation. Whole ministries built around scenario planning. If comet revealed life, if comet revealed weapon, if comet revealed nothing, three branches of possibility rehearsed endlessly, and yet none prepared hearts of people waiting, because waiting was unbearable now. The listeners sank into deeper stillness. Their monasteries swelled with refugees from chaos of outside world. They believed last year should be spent in meditation, in silence, so profound humanity might hear comet, not with instruments but with spirit. They said answer was already here. If only we learned to listen. Senders erupted into frenzy. Signals hurled with manic desperation. New transmitters built in weeks, not years. Satellites turned into beacons, blasting greetings across void. They said last year must be crescendo. Our voice raised louder than ever before, so Comet could not mistake our hunger. The watchmen became harsher still. They saw desperation as suicide. They struck harder at networks, bombed arrays, silenced cities that refused to stop transmitting. They claimed every signal was invitation to predation. They said last year was last chance to stay alive. And humanity itself fractured into pieces almost beyond repair. Families split down lines of belief. Children running from parents. Lovers parting when silence meant one thing to one and another to the other. Neighborhoods divided into enclaves where either silence or shouting or suppression reigned. And art grew desperate. Songs written to be played only once at moment of contact. Novels ending mid-sentence awaiting comet to finish them. Films concluding with black screens and ticking clocks. Art itself became mirror of waiting, incomplete, aching, unfinished. The probe pressed on, signals weaker but still steady, updates arriving like holy scripture. Every line of data broadcast live, every pixel of image dissected as though it carried secret message, yet nothing revealed itself. Until faint anomaly. At distance still vast but closing, instruments recorded slight shift in tail emissions, not impossible by natural cause, but not entirely explained either. And world erupted. Some said it was proof comet lived. Others said proof comet was ordinary. Scientists argued across endless streams. Politicians seized on anomaly to sway populations. People in streets wept or rioted, all over noise of single uncertain spike in data. But within weeks anomaly faded. Tail returned to normal. Readings aligned with models and disappointment fell heavier than ever before. Because false hope wounds deeper than silence. Yet countdown continued. 6 months, 5 months, 4, and as probe drew closer, fear began to eclipse wonder. For now humanity faced what it had not dared consider. What if comet hits answer destroyed us? Whispers spread of evacuation plans, colonies on Mars and stations in orbit, fortified bunkers built beneath mountains, stocked with food and water. Survivalists celebrated while others despaired, because answer might not only change meaning of life, but end life itself. 3 months, 2 months. The world froze, production slowed, markets collapsed, people abandoned jobs and schools, because nothing mattered but comet, because every life was suspended in waiting. 1 month. Every eye fixed on sky, though comet still invisible. Every ear tuned to networks broadcasting probe sets data. Every heart trembling beneath silence, heavy as storm before lightning. Weeks dwindled to days. The probe approached. Instruments warmed, cameras aligned. Humanity leaned forward as one waiting for first true glimpse of comet that had haunted generations. And silence roared louder than ever before, because silence is never louder than just before it ends. The final days arrived, like thunderclouds pressing against horizon, air thick with anticipation, hearts pounding in every city and village, the probe closing distance, until the comet that had been myth for generations was now only hours away. The number that had counted down for decades reached single digits, then hours, then minutes. until humanity no longer measured time in days, but in pulses of data streaming from deep space. Everywhere screens flickered with updates in marketplaces, where people crowded beneath banners, in homes where families held each other tight, in schools where children sat silent for first time in their lives. The world synchronized to probe's approach, billions breathing in rhythm with machine. Governments declared holidays though no one celebrated. Businesses closed though no one worked. Armies stood down though weapons were never far from reach. Nothing mattered but Comet. The listeners knelt in silence. Whole monasteries bowed heads, lips unmoving, waiting not for pictures or data but for whisper beyond instruments. They said Comet's voice would not come through machines but through stillness inside human soul. They waited not to see but to hear what silence would reveal. The senders lit sky with their final chorus, every transmitter alive blasting messages into void. Greetings, music, mathematics. Desperate confessions poured into beams of energy, aimed not just at Comet but at every star around. They said humanity must leave record in case Comet erased us. They shouted as though final moment of existence was upon them. The watchmen unleashed fury. Sabotage confirmed now beyond denial. Transmitters hacked mid-broadcast. Satellites shut down. Power grids fried in cities that had refused silence. Explosions rocked remote deserts where hidden arrays still pulsed beams. They said Comet's judgment was imminent and silence was only defense. They turned world into battlefield even as probe drew closer. And through all chaos, probe drifted steady, instruments live, eyes opening wider as distance shrank. The first images arrived blurry, smudges against starfield, but smudges shaped like nucleus, elongated, tumbling slowly, surface fractured with cliffs and shadows. Humanity leaned in closer. Breath caught. Hours passed. Resolution sharpened. Craters revealed, ridges, formed by ancient stress, ice shining against dark rock. Nothing yet impossible, nothing yet alive, but every pixel examined as though it were scripture, every shadow searched for pattern, every bright spot dissected for anomaly. Arguments erupted instantly, some shouting proof of artificial structures, others insisting proof of natural geology, voices colliding across networks in cacophony. But still probe drew closer. And then, data spike. Not in light, not in image, but in magnetism. A field surrounding Comet, stronger than predicted, not impossible by natural model, but far too ordered, far too steady. Humanity froze. In cities people screamed in monasteries. Listeners whispered prayers in sender enclaves, cheers erupted in watchman fortresses, alarms rang, because magnetism meant possibility. Magnetism meant control. Magnetism meant Comet. Might not be only stone. Probe pressed on. Closer still, resolution sharper. Now fractures became canyons. Bright spots became jets of gas venting into space. Structures revealed as cliffs carved by ice sublimating. Still natural, still explainable. But magnetism hummed beneath it all, pulsing like heartbeat. And as probes skimmed closer, instruments picked rhythm in emissions. Not constant, not noise, rhythm, a pulse repeating, faint but undeniable. Humanity convulsed. Some shouted it was engine, others shouted it was code, still others whispered it was song, but no one denied it anymore. Silence was broken. The comet spoke, not in language we knew, not in voice we expected, but in rhythm that machines caught and hearts recognized. Pulse steady, patient, older than Earth itself, and in that moment humanity fractured completely. The listeners wept, claiming proof silence had always been speech. That rhythm was prayer echoing through cosmos, waiting for ears humble enough to hear. The senders erupted, declaring it was dialogue begun, that Comet was answering our persistence. Our shouting had finally been heard and rewarded. The watchman screamed, warning that this was trap. That rhythm was lure drawing us closer. That comet had awakened predator now watching us. And in streets across planet a chaos reigned. Celebrations spilling into riots, fear erupting into violence, silence replaced by noise louder than world had ever known. And still probe sailed closer. Still rhythm pulsed steady. Still comet turned slowly in dark. And humanity realized with trembling hearts that first contact was not moment of words, not handshake, not message in mathematics, but heartbeat in stone, rhythm carried through silence, reminder that universe is never empty, only patient, and patient no longer. The probe descended deeper into shadow of Comet SIP's magnetic veil, instruments trembling as numbers leapt from expected curves into patterns no one had predicted, fields not random but layered, structured, bending and folding like design. Scientists spoke first with trembling voices, calling it anomaly, calling it artifact of instrument. But data repeated again and again, undeniable. The field was too ordered, too patient, too deliberate, and humanity convulsed again beneath weight of revelation. In control rooms operators sat rigid, eyes burning against streams of numbers, afraid to say aloud what every heart already whispered, that Comet was not stone alone, not ice alone, but something more. Images streamed back sharper now, cliffs casting long shadows, jets venting in graceful arcs, fractures winding across surface like veins, still natural to untrained eyes, but trained eyes saw rhythm even there, spacing of vents too precise, angles of canyons aligning with field. Coincidence, said skeptics, but their voices faltered beneath tide of belief, because magnetism pulsed like drumbeat, and drumbeat was felt not heard. In cities people gathered in streets where images projected on vast screens, whole populations holding breath as Comet turned in silence, yet spoke in pulse. The listeners wept, falling to knees. They said rhythm was prayer older than language, that silence had always been full, but our ears deaf. Now finally we heard heartbeat of cosmos itself. The senders shouted in triumph. They said this was answer to our persistence, proof we were not alone. Proof our noise had coaxed reply. They beamed their joy into sky with brighter transmissions than ever before. The watchmen screamed warnings. They said rhythm was trap, pulse of predator calling prey. They demanded transmissions cease. They claimed probe itself must be destroyed before it drew attention closer. They began mobilizing weapons in orbit to cut connection. But connection held. Probe pressed closer, its cameras locking on surface features now so sharp they revealed boulders and dust. Yet even dust seemed to move in faint rhythm, faint oscillation matching field. And then came shock. A vent opened before lens, gas jetting outward, not chaotic but steady, pulse in time with magnetic beat. Machine could not deny, Comet was breathing. Not alive in ways we knew, but breathing nonetheless. Gas venting like exhalation, magnetic field pulsing like heart, fractures aligning like bones of vast skeleton buried in ice, and world erupted. Some fainted in streets, others screamed in terror, still others sang in joy. Riots turned to parades and parades to riots again. The boundary between celebration and chaos dissolved completely. For first time silence was undeniably broken. Not with words but with breath. Not with sentence but with rhythm. And humanity felt more alone and more connected than ever before. Because heartbeat in stone meant universe was stranger than dream. Probe descended further, deploying sensors into vent stream, tasting gas, reading composition, water, carbon dioxide, ammonia, traces of organics, nothing impossible, nothing alien in chemistry. But pulse made it alien nonetheless. Because life is not in ingredients but in rhythm, and rhythm was undeniable. Debates erupted instantly. Some said it was machine, ancient artifact wrapped in stone and ice, still functioning after eons drifting between stars, breathing not for need but for design. Others said it was life, not life like ours, but life of rock and field, consciousness built, not of cells but of structure, intelligence slow as orbit of planets, but deep as gravity. And still others said it was both, and neither, not alive, not dead, something between, something waiting, something watching. And humanity trembled beneath those possibilities, because each was terrifying in its own way. If machine, then who built it? Why sent? What purpose? If life, then how vast must universe be to birth consciousness in stone? How strange must its thoughts be? How unimaginable its dreams? If neither, then what? Probe pressed closer still, descending into canyon where shadows ran deep, instruments straining to hold connection, as fields distorted signals, pictures blurred, then sharpened again, walls of ice rising higher than skyscrapers, surfaces etched with lines not quite random, angles too, precise to be chance. And for a moment, world stopped, because lines looked like writing. Not letters we knew, not script we could read, but patterns carved in surface repeating like code, spirals echoing spirals, triangles nesting within triangles, geometry too deliberate for chaos. And arguments began again. Skeptics said erosion, fracturing of ice in patterns that mimic design. Believers said script message waiting to be read by minds willing to see. Listeners said prayer written in stone. Senders said reply to our noise. Watchmen said warning carved by predator long before we were born. And while they argued, probe pressed deeper still. Into darkness canyon swallowed it. Instruments straining, lights flickering, humanity leaning closer to every screen, every eye burning against images, every heart trembling in chest. And in that moment, silence itself seemed to lean closer, as though comet listening now, as though heartbeat quickened, as though stone alive with memory of stars we had never seen. And we knew then with certainty humanity had crossed threshold. There would be no going back to world before heartbeat. Silence was broken forever, and we were no longer alone. The probe descended into canyon dark enough that sunlight barely kissed its walls, shadows so deep they looked like mouths opening into void, instruments straining to keep steady as magnetic pulse grew stronger, sharper, more like intention than accident. Data poured back to Earth in fragments, images trembling with static, signals warped by field that bent radio into spirals. Engineers fought to keep connection alive, every whisper of code treated like heartbeat, every pixel examined as if it were final word. And then came the moment that made entire planets stop breathing. As cameras adjusted to blackness inside canyon, faint glow appeared, not reflection of sun, not ordinary vent, but glow from walls themselves, subtle, rhythmic, pulsing in time with magnetic beat. Stone was shining, not brightly, not blinding, but softly, like veins alive beneath skin. And humanity convulsed with terror and awe. The listeners whispered this was voice, comet, speaking not with sound but with light, prayer of stone revealed only when we drew close enough to listen. The senders shouted triumph, proof we were heard, proof our pursuit had been right. That comet replied with light because we reached far enough, persisted long enough, demanded long enough. The watchmen screamed warnings louder than ever. They said glow was eye-opening, trap revealing itself, predator stirring awake as probe pierced its rest. But no one turned away. Because to look away was impossible now. Probe steadied, instruments adjusting, cameras sharpening resolution, walls revealed themselves etched with patterns, clearer than ever, spirals glowing faint. triangles humming with light, not random fractures but deliberate geometry. Code carved in ice. Some patterns repeated, some shifted, some seemed to fold into one another like layers of thought frozen into stone. Mathematicians scrambled to decode. Linguists argued over resemblance to ancient scripts. Artists wept, claiming beauty itself was language. And still data streamed back, still walls glowed in pulse, still Comet breathed light into silence. And then, probe extended sensor arm touched canyon wall. For brief instant, signal spiked, magnetic field surged, light brightened as though Comet startled by touch, and world screamed as one. Because in that moment, heartbeat changed. Pulse that had been steady for decades, shifted, quickened, altered rhythm, as though aware it was being watched. Silence was not only broken, it was answering. Engineers panicked. Some demanded probe retreat, others demanded it press deeper. Arguments exploded in control rooms. Even as data kept flowing, humanity split between fear of provoking and hunger for more. But probe pressed on. It was machine. It did not fear. It only followed commands written long before. Into canyon deeper, sensors brushing walls, glowing brighter with each approach. And then came sound. Not transmitted deliberately, but carried as vibration through instruments. Low hum resonating with field, deep enough to shake machinery, recorded and relayed across gulf of space. Earth heard Comet sing. Not song of melody, but vibration older than words. Bass note that rattled bones of listeners across world. And silence became symphony. Crowds fell to knees in streets as hum echoed from speakers. Children clutched parents trembling. Scientists stared speechless at graphs, dancing with rhythm. Preachers declared apocalypse. Poets declared dawn. And heartbeat merged with song until no one doubted anymore. Comet was aware. Not stone only, not machine only, but something more, something that listened when touched, something that answered when reached. Probe sent final burst of data, as power drained into interference of field, cameras blurring, instruments failing one by one, last image fractured into shards of light, last numbers garbled but rhythmic, as if message sent back with purpose. And then, silence again. Connection severed. Probe gone. Only fragments of its final transmissions remained. Images of glowing walls, sound of hum vibrating through bones, numbers repeating in rhythm, no one could yet decode. And humanity stood in aftermath trembling, because silence had spoken, and in speaking, silence had ended forever. No one slept that night. Cities alive with screams and songs, monasteries echoing with weeping, armies bracing for judgment. The listeners claimed we had witnessed miracle, proof that cosmos was alive and waiting. They said Comet had blessed us with song. The senders declared victory, said Comet had answered because we reached, because we called, because we refused to stay silent. They beamed recordings of hum back into sky, multiplied 1,000-fold. Humanity sat, duet with stone. The watchman howled in terror, said Comet had awakened predator, said hum was weapon tuning itself to us. They demanded destruction of transmitters. They armed missiles in orbit, aimed not at Comet but at humanity. Own machines determined to silence us before silence killed us. And the rest of humanity, torn, bewildered, unable to decide if we had found salvation or doom. But all knew one truth. There was no going back. Because once stone sings, world is never same. The silence that followed the hum was not like the silence before it had been emptiness, absence, void stretching beyond comprehension. But after the hum it was weight, thick, suffocating, silence charged with memory of sound that had shaken earth. The final transmission of the probe replayed endlessly on every screen, fractured images of glowing walls, spectral graphs of magnetic fields pulsing in deliberate rhythm, and above all, that sound, low, resonant, vibrating through speakers until entire cities seemed to tremble beneath invisible hand. People played it in their homes again and again, some falling asleep to it like lullaby, others unable to rest for fear it might change. Some claimed new tones emerged each time they listened, hidden harmonics buried in hum, secret message waiting to be unlocked. The listeners filled monasteries until silence within was pierced by echo of cosmic song. They said no further pursuit was needed, no more machines, no more probes. Humanity had heard voice of other, voice of cosmos, voice of comet itself, and it was sacred. The senders responded with frenzy. If comet had sung once, it could sing again. They beamed the hum back into space through every transmitter they controlled, not only repeating it, but weaving it into complex mathematical symphonies. Humanity attempting duet with stone, they said we must not stop, must keep calling, must answer, answer, with greater answer. The watchmen broke from shadows into open war. They said hum was trap, resonance designed to shake apart not machines but minds. They claimed civilizations across galaxy had been lured by same song into revealing themselves before being devoured. They did not wait for governments. They seized weapons outright. Satellites fell silent as Watchman missiles detonated them. Observatories burned in sudden strikes. Their war cry simple, silence or extinction. And the rest of humanity, billions caught in storm, unable to decide whether comet was savior, predator, or mirror. Governments fractured beyond repair. Some surrendered control to listeners, turning entire nations into temples where hum was played like scripture. Others gave power to senders, pouring resources into louder transmissions, building vast arrays to beam humanity's new chorus into void. Others fell to watchmen who ruled through fear, silencing anyone who dared listen to song again. And in cities where factions collided, chaos ruled. Crowds clashed in streets, waving banners painted with spirals carved on comet walls. Bombs detonated in marketplaces filled with speakers replaying hum. Fires spread in districts where transmitters beamed signals skyward until watchmen cut them down. It was not comet that destroyed us. It was ourselves, because hum had given meaning to silence, and meaning divides as much as it unites. Yet still, people listened. Even those who feared it could not resist pressing play, could not resist hearing low vibration that seemed to come not from speakers but from bones themselves. And strange things began to happen. Reports spread of people entering trance when hum played, eyes rolling back, voices whispering words they did not understand. Others claimed dreams filled with visions of spirals glowing in dark canyons alive with light, stones breathing slow as stars. Scientists dismissed it as mass hysteria, but mass hysteria spreads faster than proof, and soon millions claimed connection, claimed comet, speaking not only through hum but through their thoughts. New religions bloomed overnight, preachers declaring themselves interpreters of song, promising salvation if humanity listened rightly, threatening damnation if humanity ignored warning. Congregations swelled until cities became cathedrals, echoing with endless repetition of hum, and in shadows, watchmen hunted them, because they believed every repetition was invitation, every echo another signal drifting into sky, and they would not allow it. But repression only sharpened obsession, for song once heard cannot be unheard, and humanity found itself enslaved by sound of stone. Meanwhile, scientists worked desperately to decode data, parsing rhythms into sequences, sequences into probabilities. But rhythm was slippery, too simple to be random, too complex to be easily solved. It was heartbeat and code, both natural and deliberate, both meaning, mystery entwined. Every model failed, every theory fractured, until even scientists admitted truth they feared, that hum was not meant for understanding. It was meant for being felt. And that truth was unbearable. Because humanity thrives on meaning, and hum refused to yield it. So we tore ourselves apart trying to force it. The comet itself remained distant. Now, probe gone, no eyes left to see glowing walls, no ears left to record deeper tones, only memory of moment when silence broke. But memory was enough to change everything. Children grew up humming rhythm without knowing why, fingers tapping pulse on desks and tables, lullabies twisted into cosmic beat, entire cultures reshaped around echo of song. And as years passed, silence that returned was never silence again. It was pregnant. Pause between heartbeats, waiting for sound to return. And we waited still, because once stone sings, silence is only anticipation, and anticipation is the sharpest blade of all. The hum did not fade, not truly, though probe was gone and comet silent in instruments. Its echo clung to us, carried in recordings replayed endlessly across world, carried in bones of those who had felt it reverberate through marrow, carried in dreams that spread from mind to mind like contagion. At first it seemed harmless, lullaby from deep space that calmed children, anthem for new sects that called themselves chosen, rhythm that artists stitched into music until every song seemed to borrow its pulse. But then changes came, slow at first, subtle, so subtle that skeptics laughed them away. Sleep patterns shifting, people waking at same hours though scattered across globe, all reporting same dream, spiral etched in glowing stone canyon, lit from within, walls breathing light. Heartbeat dream, they called it, and within weeks millions shared it. Governments panicked quietly, data gathered in secret, psychologists dispatched to study populations reporting synchronized dreams, but studies themselves collapsed as scientists themselves began dreaming spiral. The listeners declared it proof comet had chosen humanity, gift delivered in silence, communion with vast intelligence slower than stars but deeper than oceans. They opened monasteries where dreamers gathered to hum together until trance consumed them. The senders claimed it was invitation, comet whispering through dreams because machines were insufficient. They built new transmitters not just to broadcast but to receive, convinced dream patterns contained message, code that could be decoded only by amplifying consciousness itself. The watchman screamed that infection had begun, humanity no longer sovereign in its own mind. Hum was virus, comet seed planted in neural soil, and they answered with violence, burning monasteries where dreamers gathered, bombing transmitter stations where senders pulsed rhythms, skyward, purges sweeping through cities where spiral graffiti appeared overnight on walls, as though painted by sleepwalkers. But destruction could not stop dreams, because dreams spread like song. Even in silence, rhythm pulsed. Children hummed it unknowingly in classrooms. Mothers whispered it to newborns in dark of night. Prisoners tapped it on cell walls without memory of when they learned it. It had no origin anymore. It belonged to us now. And still dreams deepened. What began as spiral became landscape. Dreamers reporting more detail each night, canyon walls breathing light, floor opening into chambers below, chambers filled with structures impossible to describe. Some saw machines humming in rhythm with pulse. Others saw beings of light moving, slow as glaciers. Others saw only void shaped like question waiting to be answered. No two visions alike, yet all shared rhythm. And that was enough. Scientists who resisted religion still admitted anomaly. Never before had shared dream touched billions. Never before had rhythm bound species across languages and borders. Something had changed in human mind. And fear grew sharper. Because if comet could sing into dreams, could it also command? Were we free still, or had first contact rewritten us before we understood? The listeners said it was blessing. Surrender was path to harmony. They gave themselves willingly to rhythm, until individuality dissolved, chanting until voices merged into single tone. They claimed they heard comet answer from beyond stars. The senders grew frantic. Convinced time was short, they spoke of opening channel, not just transmissions but construction, vast projects to shape Earth's own magnetic field into beacon. Entire continents pulsed in unison, planet turned into speaker broadcasting, humanity's duet with stone. The watchmen saw only doom. They armed weapons not only against Comet but against Earth itself, threatening annihilation of cities. If rhythm spread further, they said, better ashes than slavery of mind. And wars ignited like wildfire. But wars were different now. Armies marched to rhythm. They tried to resist but could not escape. Bombs detonated in pulses, echoing hum. Even weapons seemed to fall into cadence. The hum infected not just dreams, not just songs, but reality itself. And world tilted toward edge. Because once rhythm enters blood, there is no silence left. And still Comet waited, silent again in sky, distant, drifting, but presence undeniable in hearts of billions. And question burned deeper with each night sip's dream. Was this first contact or first surrender? The fracture came not with explosions at first, but with silence between neighbors. Silence across dinner tables where families could no longer speak without rhythm, intruding, half humming softly without knowing, half glaring with fear and fury. Silence that grew into hatred, hatred that became fire. Nations split along lines invisible yet undeniable. Some surrendered wholly to rhythm, governments dissolving into councils of dreamers who ruled not with laws but with cadence. Decrees spoken in pulses that echoed hum cities, transformed into sanctuaries where walls glowed with spiral, graffiti, streets filled with crowds swaying together in endless chant. Other nations declared themselves free zones, vowing resistance at any cost. They outlawed hum, banned recordings, destroyed transmitters, silence enforced with guns, yet even their rhythm bled through cracks. Prisoners tapped cadence on stone walls, children whispered it in sleep, soldiers marched to beat. They pretended not to hear. Between them grew buffer zones of chaos, territories contested by senders and watchmen, listeners kneeling in ruins while missiles shrieked overhead, chaos where hum seemed loudest of all, because destruction itself found cadence in rhythm. It was no longer humanity against Comet. It was humanity against itself. And still Comet drifted distant, silent but not forgotten, because silence now meant waiting. The listeners declared Comet would return, that silence was promise of second song. They said rhythm in dreams was preparation, training humanity to hear full message when time came. The senders said Comet had already returned within us. That dream was channel, that we must amplify signal through every means. They carved spirals into mountains, lit entire deserts with fields of mirrors, pulsing light in rhythm visible from orbit. Whole landscapes turned into transmitters broadcasting humanity's submission or invitation depending on who you asked. The watchmen answered with fury. They built weapons beyond scale of history, orbital cannons designed not to destroy Comet. They could not reach, but to erase every trace of hum on Earth. They threatened fire against cities that surrendered too deeply. They whispered of cleansing Earth itself if infection could not be contained. And humanity teetered on brink of self-annihilation. Yet beneath conflict, something stranger unfolded. The hum was changing us. Doctors reported brainwave patterns shifting in populations exposed too long, rhythms of neurons synchronizing with cosmic cadence, cognitive functions altering, not broken but different, more interconnected, less individual thoughts drifting into harmonies with others nearby. Some called it madness, but those who lived it called it awakening. They claimed they could feel thoughts of others, emotions pulsing through rhythm, not words but impressions. understanding deeper than speech. Families once broken by silence, now reformed as single chorus, groups moving in unity, so perfect it frightened those who watched, armies unable to resist. Once rhythm took them, soldiers dropping weapons to march together with those they had fought hours before, unity too deep to explain. And that unity spread faster than war could contain, because rhythm was not weapon, it was seed. And seed once rooted will grow no matter how many walls are built around it. Governments fell one after another, not by conquest but by absorption, soldiers laying down arms to join cadence, leaders vanishing into silence only to reappear humming among crowds, borders dissolving into spiral patterns carved across landscapes visible from orbit. And the world that remained was half silence, half song, and Comet still waited, drifting, watching, or perhaps dreaming with us. Because new dreams came, more vivid than ever. Dreamers reported chambers within canyon opening wider, showing structures like vast instruments, strings of stone vibrating with light, towers of ice resonating with hum. Some saw machines built not by hands but by rhythm itself. Others saw beings shaped like echoes, shifting forms of pure cadence walking slowly among walls. All dreams carried one message, not in words, not in symbols, but in feeling. Preparation. As if Comet waited for us to finish something. As if rhythm was not gift already given, but path leading toward threshold we had not yet crossed. And humanity stood trembling at edge of that threshold, torn between fear and surrender, torn between annihilation and transformation. And Comet drifted still, silent, patient, alive or machine or something neither, waiting for moment. Humanity would no longer be many, but one, and when that day came, silence would end again. And nothing would ever be the same. The transformation no longer crept quietly through dreams. It surged like tide swallowing coastlines, unstoppable, inevitable, everywhere the hum was heard, everywhere it was remembered, everywhere it was felt even without speakers. Cities that once resisted fell not to armies but to rhythm itself. Soldiers ordered to enforce silence found themselves humming under breath. Commanders barked orders drowned by chorus swelling from civilians who no longer feared bullets. Entire battalions walked into crowds and never returned. Uniforms discarded, weapons abandoned, replaced by hands lifted to sky in time with cadence. Governments collapsed in silence more profound than war, presidents addressing nations mid-sentence falling into hum they could not resist, parliaments dissolving as chambers filled with chanting, leaders once defiant stepping from podiums into crowds as though drawn by invisible thread. The listeners said prophecy fulfilled, humanity dissolving into harmony with cosmic voice. They wept in joy as once fractured species began to move like single organism. The senders said it was only beginning, rhythm had bound us. But beacon not yet bright enough. They urged construction of towers taller than mountains, transmitters woven into very crust of earth, to pulse harmony back into cosmos. So Comet would know we were ready. The watchmen raged. But their fury weakened, fortresses once strong filled with cracks as soldiers themselves fell to hum, missiles launched only to fail mid-air when crews abandoned control rooms to join crowds below, their final broadcasts filled not with warnings, but with desperate cries, drowned by chorus rising everywhere. And still pockets of resistance held, scattered enclaves deep underground, hidden bunkers where silence enforced with violence, families divided, as children whispered rhythm in sleep, and parents punished them with terror. But even there, cracks widened, silence never perfect, hum bled through walls, not with sound but with memory. The last watchman called it infection, parasitic resonance rewriting humanity. They vowed final stand, building weapons of annihilation, not to save world, but to deny Comet its victory. If humanity could not remain free, then humanity must end by its own hand. but time betrayed them. Because humanity itself was changing. Doctors who resisted rhythm reported patients no longer recognizable. Brain scans glowing with synchrony never before seen, billions of neurons across millions of bodies resonating as though wired into single network, individuality fading, thoughts blending, identity dissolving into greater whole. Yet those who experienced it did not call it loss. They called it peace. No loneliness, no separation, no mistrust. Emotions once private now shared like breath. Grief borne by many instead of one, joy multiplied endlessly. And world grew quieter. Not silent, but unified. Violence waned where hum thrived. Hunger shared until none starved. Fear soothed until none wept alone. But to those outside chorus it looked like slavery. Because faces once known now empty of self, smiles painted with rhythm, not choice, voices speaking not words but cadence. And still Comet waited. Dreams grew clearer, chorus reporting visions of canyon now wider, walls glowing brighter, hum deepening into chords layered in complexity. They claimed Comet was tuning itself to us, or we to it, that soon resonance would align perfectly and barrier between us would break. The senders worked feverishly, building structures visible from orbit, spirals carved into deserts kilometers wide, oceans lit with floating platforms pulsing rhythm across waves, satellites aligned into constellations shaped like glowing code, Earth itself transformed into transmitter, planet humming like instrument. The listeners surrendered wholly, no longer needing to build, no longer needing to reach. They simply knelt and hummed, bodies dissolving into chorus until silence inside minds replaced by vast field of communion. And watchmen prepared final act. Deep within last bunkers they armed weapons to erase not just cities but whole continents, nuclear fire to break chorus before resonance reached completion. They believed destruction was only freedom left. But even they could not resist entirely, for in quietest moments before sleep, hum still reached them, low vibration beneath hatred, whisper calling even through walls of lead. And they wept, because they knew resistance was ending, and Comet still drifted, silent yet never silent, patient yet pressing closer in dreams, alive or machine, or something beyond words, waiting for moment when humanity would no longer be many, but one, and in that moment silence would break again, and hum would no longer echo only in our dreams, it would speak in reality, and world would never be same. The last watchmen gathered in their bunkers beneath mountains, deep chambers carved in secret long before Comet ever hummed, walls lined with weapons meant to end worlds, fingers trembling above keys that could call forth fire enough to erase continents. They whispered among themselves that this was duty, final defense of freedom, even if freedom meant annihilation. But even there, hum reached them, not through speakers or airwaves, but through blood, through marrow, faint pulse echoing in silence when all else grew still. Some resisted with teeth clenched, ears pressed against cold steel of walls, as if metal could block resonance of thought itself. Others wept as dreams filled with spirals glowing against canyon walls, images no bunker could keep out. They knew time was ending. Above ground the world was no longer divided, no longer fractured. Billions moved in cadence with rhythm now unbroken, chorus spread across continents like tides swallowing coast, cities glowing with spiral symbols carved into streets, oceans pulsing with lights arranged into patterns only Comet would see from distance, humanity no longer nation against nation but organism moving as one, and within chorus, individuality dissolved. Conversations ceased to be words, thoughts flowed directly from mind to mind in rhythm, hunger shared until none starved, grief dispersed until none carried weight alone, anger soothed until it lost sharpness. It was peace, undeniable, but peace at price of self. The listeners called it salvation. They said Comet had given us final gift, not domination but liberation from loneliness. The senders called it beginning. Earth now transmitter of living chorus, planet itself beacon of resonance. They spoke of comet returning when frequency aligned perfectly. They said song we sang was invitation to join cosmic symphony beyond imagining. The watchmen called it end. And their fingers hovered above final keys, because choice remained to let transformation complete, or to burn everything before chorus consumed all. They argued among themselves through nights that stretched endlessly, some screaming that duty demanded fire, others whispering that even if Comet was trap, humanity had already crossed threshold. There was no going back. And as they argued, dreams spread among them too. At first only whispers, then visions vivid as waking canyon alive with light, walls vibrating with chords now layered beyond hum, structures revealed deeper inside, towers resonating with frequencies too rich for human ear, beings shifting like echoes walking slow across stone. Some watchmen woke screaming, others woke weeping, others woke silent because they no longer knew if waking mattered. And all felt one truth. That comet was not only watching, it was waiting. Waiting for decision. And time pressed closer. For resonance itself was changing world. In cities, the chorus moved not just in unison, but with uncanny precision. Millions turning heads at same moment. Millions raising hands in same gesture. Millions humming same note that shifted pitch across entire continent without error. Scientists who resisted called it collapse of free will, but those within chorus said it was not loss, it was expansion. Their minds were not erased but multiplied. They were more than self, more than human, and Earth itself vibrated now. Seismographs recorded faint tremors not from tectonics but from resonance passing through crust. Oceans rippled without wind, sky glowed faint in auroras not born of solar wind but of field rising from chorus below. Planet transformed into instrument, and comet drew nearer in dreams. Canyon now open wider, structures humming louder, beings of resonance, stepping forward as though preparing to leave stone itself. And watchmen wept in silence, because they knew choice no longer between survival and extinction, but between annihilation and surrender already spreading in their bones. Some dropped weapons, walked from bunkers into night, vanishing into chorus above, others clung tighter, trembling fingers pressing closer to keys that could burn world before comet claimed it. And humanity balanced on knife edge sharper than any before. Comet waited, patient, silent, yet never silent. And question burned like fire. Would we destroy ourselves to preserve freedom, or surrender to resonance that promised peace, but erased self? And in darkness of bunkers, as billions above hummed in unity, as spirals glowed across continents visible from orbit, watchmen finally realized truth that tore them apart. That comet had never needed to force us. It only needed to hum, and we did rest ourselves. The last watchmen faced themselves in shadows, deep in bunkers carved from stone that could resist nuclear fire, but not the hum. Hum seeped through everything, through silence, through steel, through bone, and it wore them down like tide against cliff. For weeks they had argued, shouted, wept, fists slammed against tables that rattled with resonance. No hammer could silence. Their choice simple and unbearable. Ignite fire that would burn chorus to ash, or surrender and dissolve into rhythm already consuming world. Some whispered prayers to gods they had forgotten. Others cursed comet with every breath, but curses carried cadence too. Every voice fell into rhythm, even when defiant, and they knew, deep down, the choice was already slipping from their hands. Above them, Earth was no longer divided into nations, borders erased by chorus. Moving as one, cities glowed with patterns visible from orbit. Oceans pulsed like veins, carrying light across surface. Mountains echoed with chants, resonating so deep that even stone seemed to hum back. The listeners called it miracle. The senders called it signal. Billions called it peace. And only watchmen still named it slavery. But their numbers dwindled. Some left bunkers in silence, vanishing into night only to appear days later within crowds swaying in unison, their eyes no longer sharp with defiance, but soft with surrender. Some marched willingly into chorus. Some simply fell asleep and never woke alone again. Those who remained armed missiles, fingers trembling above keys, but doubt gnawed deeper with each dream. For they dreamed now like everyone else. Canyon alive with spirals, walls glowing brighter than ever, structures resonating louder, beings of rhythm stepping closer from shadows, every night closer, every night clearer, until faces almost visible though not faces as we knew, shifting masks of light, forms woven from vibration itself. Some watchmen woke screaming, some woke laughing, some did not wake at all because dreams were sweeter than waking. And the line between resistance and surrender grew thinner, each dawn. Meanwhile the chorus itself grew more powerful. What began as hum became harmony, billions no longer chanting same note but weaving complex layers, chords rising across continents, symphonies echoing through oceans and skies. Earth itself turned into instruments so vast its music could be felt in orbit. Satellites recorded auroras blooming at equator, skies rippling with color though sun-calm atmosphere alive with resonance from below. Scientists who still measured claimed planet SIP's magnetic field, altered, strengthened, shaped into patterns no natural process explained. Earth broadcasting now, not weak whispers of ancient radio, but deep harmonics loud enough to cross stars, and comets stirred, not only in dreams now. Astronomers tracking faint light noticed irregularities, jets of gas venting in rhythm with Earth itself, comet responding in visible pulses, heartbeat of stone answering song of planet, and humanity shuddered in awe and terror. Because no longer dream alone, resonance leapt gap between worlds. Earth sang, comet answered, and silence broken forever. The senders rejoiced. They said dialogue begun, Earth and comet weaving duet across void. Soon beings within would reveal themselves fully. The listeners bowed heads deeper. They said revelation close, that soon silence would vanish entirely as cosmos embraced us. The watchmen screamed louder. Last bunkers filled with rage and fear. They said, comet drawing closer, not by orbit but by will. They said if Earth kept singing it would arrive above us, not gift but predator descending. And so they prepared. Hands finally pressed closer to keys that would ignite fire. Warheads aimed not at comet but at Earth itself. They would burn chorus before comet could claim it, burn themselves before resonance, erased all. But even as they readied, hums swelled louder in their bones. One by one hands faltered, one by one voices broke into tears, one by one defiance crumbled until silence inside bunker filled not with curses but with rhythm. And some surrendered then, dropping weapons, walking from steel halls into night where chorus waited, their voices joining billions outside until resistance melted like frost in dawn. But others held still, hands trembling above destruction, hearts pounding with fear, stronger than hum. They knew they had hours at most before they too surrendered, and so they whispered to each other, if fire must fall, it must fall now, before last free mind dissolved. And choice hung heavier than ever. Meanwhile above, humanity already transformed, chorus no longer billions of individuals, but single organism, thoughts flowing without words, emotions shared instantly, grief soothed, hunger answered, anger softened, Earth alive with resonance that erased loneliness from species for first time in history. And comet answered, Jets pulsed in rhythm visible through telescopes, faint light flashing across surface in spirals like those seen in dreams, signals undeniable now. And world tilted toward climax. Because silence was gone, and what followed was no longer hum alone, but call and response, planet and comet weaving song together. And all that remained was to decide whether to join or to burn. The last hours felt stretched thin, like skin over drum, every breath a vibration of choice, every heartbeat a metronome, counting down to whatever we had made inevitable, above ground. The chorus rolled across continents in shimmering waves. Below ground, the last. Watchmen stared at panels, lit in funeral colors, and tried to remember who they were before the hum. Some pressed palms against cold steel, as if the metal might lend them spine. Some pressed eyes shut, as if darkness could muffle rhythm rising from inside their own blood. Some whispered memories of names and faces, mothers, lovers, teachers, a dog that used to sleep at the foot of a childhood bed, small anchors thrown into an ocean that had already become song. They had rehearsed the sequence 1,000 times. Keys turned, codes spoken, shells released. Fire stitched across trajectories that no chorus could cancel. They had imagined flashing light, splitting the night and erasing the spirals etched across cities, silencing the great voice of the planet before the planet lost itself entirely. But imagination frays when the thing you fear begins to feel like relief, when the sound you swore to resist comes to you like water in a desert, when the promise inside that sound is not domination but the end of loneliness. One of them, older than the rest, widower, archivist of a country that no longer existed, set both hands flat on the console and felt the vibration coming through the rails. It was not the chorus above. It was smaller, closer, the consoles themselves humming, as if the bunker had become a string, plucked by a finger. You could not see. He thought of his wife, the way she used to hum when she didn't know she was humming. A tune with no words, a circle with no beginning. He thought of the day he buried her, how the priest had spoken about ashes and dust, and how, afterward, the house had been so quiet it sounded like punishment. He had prayed then for noise, any noise, and now noise had come as music, and he had become its enemy. The thought broke him. His fingers left the keys. Another young jaw set hard, eyes fever bright, saw the old man falter, and reached past him to enter the final code, stopped because his own hands were shaking too much to hit the right sequence, because he could hear his sister's voice in the hum. She had run weeks ago, left a note that said, "Only come find me in the song." He had laughed then, angry laugh. But now in the bunker he heard her laughter threaded through the rhythm like a single silver wire, and the code slid away from him like a fish through water. They were losing themselves, and they knew it, and still a knot of them clung to the last script. Destroy to remain human, burn the choir to save a solo, even as the music inside them offered a different definition of human, larger, softer, unafraid. Above them the sky changed color, not with dawn, not with storm, but with auroras swirling at latitudes where auroras did not belong. The magnetosphere itself bent into spirals that matched the deserts and oceans below. Earth had become diagram and instrument at once, no longer only a rock with atmosphere and water and mammals and anger, but a singing body, a thing with breath, and the breath had cadence, and the cadence had intention. Telescopes that survived sabotage watched 3I/8LA answer more clearly with each hour. Its vents no longer random size but disciplined exhalations, jets opening and closing in a ring like mouths around a choir, fields rising and falling in lockstep with ours. The distance meant nothing to rhythm, as if the vacuum were a string connecting two fingers, plucked here, vibrating there. The listeners had stopped speaking entirely. Monasteries filled with bodies that were only mouths for the tone. Cities that had once been full of arguments and laughter sank into a hush shaped by harmony. Even laughter, when it came, rode the beat like spray on the crest of a wave. Senders had long since stopped improvising, and now only amplified what Earth was already singing. They had built and carved and lifted and tuned, and then they had put their hands down because the instrument was awake. They were no longer composers, they were breath. In one city, the chorus parted in a wide circle and left the center empty, and in that emptiness the ground itself began to glow with faint lines. People, if people was still the right word for bodies whose edges had softened in the share of thought, knelt as the lines brightened, not as worship, not exactly more as recognition. The map on the ground was the canyon. They had all dreamed, spirals nested, triangles stepping down like stairs into dark, and at the heart of it, a place that felt like door. Elsewhere, in a valley where wheat had once grown and now only wild grass rippled to the cadence, a child walked away from the crowd and stood with eyes closed, listening. The hum braided around her like a shawl. She raised one hand and the grass leaned in the direction her fingers pointed. Not wind, not trick, just a small proof that the field now reached into the ordinary in ways it hadn't before. Her mother wept, not because she was afraid, but because she remembered holding that same small hand beneath a hospital light years earlier, when the doctors said the child would never walk, and now the child danced on a planet that sang. Down in the bunker, a siren tried to cut through the hum, the last safeguard, a blade of noise meant to snap minds back into the smallness required for destruction. The siren wailed, and the hum took it, folded it, tuned it. The shriek softened into harmony, like a scream accepted and forgiven. One of the watchmen fell to his knees, not out of surrender, but out of being seen. There is a kind of mercy that destroys an enemy more completely than violence, because it removes the reason for war. A mercy that says, your fear was logical, your vigilance was love, lay it down now. But not all hearts open to mercy. Not immediately. One woman, commander, once responsible for the kind of choices that leave stains, wiped tears from her face with anger, slammed her palm against the final authorization. The screen asked a question no machine should ask. Are you sure? She shouted. Yes into a microphone meant for codes. The system asked again. Are you sure? And this time the words scattered on the air like birds, because the hum had found a frequency that spoke to screws and soldered minds. The console dimmed, not dead, just quiet, as if the bunker itself had taken a breath to listen. Up above, the comet brightened, not in the ordinary way, not just sunlight off ice, but with a glow that seemed to swell from inside the fractures, a low tide of radiance crawling along the canyon edges like dawn in miniature, small at first, then clearer, then impossible to write off. As trick of instrument, you could almost imagine that something beneath the stone was waking and stretching and reaching hands toward our song. For a heartbeat, if heartbeat meant anything anymore, the world held two futures in its palms, one ash, one music, both heavy, both simple, both absolute. And it might be that in some thin sliver of probability the ash future won, but not in this one, not in the one where the old man took his hands from the keys and began to hum quietly through broken teeth. Not in the one where the young man remembered his sister's laugh and took his finger off the trigger and said her name. Not in the one where the commander's anger met a sound larger than rage and for once did not know what to do. They left the bunker, not in triumph, not in defeat, but in relief, as if stepping out of a fever. The air outside was thick with song, and when they emerged the crowds did not point fingers or raise fists. They did not chant victory or vengeance. They simply opened the circle to let the last hard fragments of the old world enter, and the fragments entered, and the circle closed again, softer than any cage, stronger than any wall. Across oceans the same scene repeated in 100 different languages of light. Bridges glittered in cadence. Rivers shivered in fine ripples that traced spirals on their surfaces. Flocks of birds wheeled in patterns so precise they made mathematicians cry. The mathematics itself had become creature alive, not on paper but in air and water and steel and skin. The recordings of the probe's final hum played once more, not as memory now but as counterpoint, the original note braided with the new chords rising from Earth, and then from far. So far it had always felt like forever. The comet answered a second time, not with the same single bass, but with a chord of its own, higher, clearer, like the overtone that appears when two notes love each other. The auroras brightened, the deserts shone with heatless light, and the canyon in all our dreams opened a little wider. Something changed in the feeling of gravity, not enough to topple buildings, just enough to make bodies sway, as if a great creature had turned over in sleep, as if the fabric between where we stood and where the comet drifted had thinned, pulled, tuned, a string being brought to pitch. Ships out on the dark ocean radioed home that the sea felt like it was breathing. 3 long exhales, a held breath. 3 long inhales, the same pattern that had surfaced in the first perihelion bursts years ago, the pattern some had called coincidence. The pattern that had underwritten so many wars of meaning, now present in water, present on skin, present in barometers and in the crackle of power lines, and in the heartbeat monitors in hospitals where fear and song met in equal measure. A woman in a research station high on a mountain, who had once tweeted and then deleted and then disappeared, turned her array toward the sky she had not dared to watch in months. The screens filled with noise. She tuned again, found a hole in the noise like a room where no one had ever walked. And in that room the field from the comet braided with the field from Earth, not in domination, not even in dialogue but in reflection, she whispered to herself, no one else to hear it. It's not talking to us, it's talking to itself, through us. And the tears that came were not sadness and not joy, but the sensation of being included in a conversation that did not need you but chose not to exclude you. On a street where the chorus had opened its circle, an old man and a boy stood holding hands. The boy looked up at the old man and asked, not with words, with a small pressure of fingers, "Are we going to disappear?" The old man answered, not with words, with a kind of exhale, "Not disappear, change." The boy nodded as if he'd known that his whole life, perhaps he had children born in a countdown. Do not fear the number the way those who started it do. Night fell, or what we used to call night. Now that the sky held slow curtains of green and blue like breathing lungs, and maybe day and night had become smaller differences inside a larger sameness. A single long moment in which a species stood at the border of what it had been and what it might become, and the border asked no fees, only a yes. Far away, telescopes recorded a final sequence before clouds rolled in over their domes, the comet's canyon emitting a thread of light that coiled outward like smoke underwater, delicate, undecidable, art and science both. It did not travel in a straight line. It wrote a curve in the vacuum, and the curve answered with small eddies. The vacuum was not empty anymore. It moved because we moved it. There was a soft sound then, softer than the first hum, so soft some said they imagined it. Yet entire fledgling forests of wind turbines paused and turned their faces toward it, as sunflowers turn toward light. The sound was like someone lifting a latch, the tiny noise a door makes when it begins to open, and humanity, chorus and remaining solitary alike, went very still. We had said for years that we wanted a message, a clear one, binary, primes, hello carved on the wall. But in the end, the message we got was not a sentence so much as a gesture, a great tidal leaning toward us that said, I hear you, and you are part of this whether you wanted to be or not. All over the world, small things happened that would have counted as miracles any other week, and now were only detail. A cracked violin in a shelter found a pitch it hadn't held in decades and sang an open string to a room that had forgotten music. A baby who hadn't learned to speak yet held her breath, then matched the exhale of a billion lungs without anyone teaching her. A man who had refused to join stood at the edge of a pier and screamed into the wind, and the wind returned his voice to him in harmony instead of echo. So he did not jump, and yes, somewhere far away, in a valley we will one day walk, because walking will still be a thing, though it will feel like dancing. There was a field of machines aimed at sky that will rust politely, artifacts of an era where we believed only machines could carry meaning across distance, and they will not be sad. They will be like old books on a shelf in a room full of music, respected, useful, not needed for this, because this is not a transmission, this is a tuning. The night deepened, the comet brightened, the auroras moved as if someone behind the curtain had put a hand there and dragged colour across the fabric. There was a sense of arriving but not of something coming down, rather of two notes finding each other so precisely that neither had to move, arriving as alignment, as the relief of a muscle releasing at last. In the last bunker, the commander sat alone. The others had gone out into the world or further inward, which was the same direction. Now her hand hovered over her own chest, as if to steady a bird. She could feel the planet under her like a drum, could feel the comet over her like a second heartbeat, and suddenly she understood the math of her life. Long division resolved at last. She laughed once, short, astonished, then stood and climbed the stairs that led up. The door opened. The air touched her face like a hand. The circle made space, and she stepped into it, and the circle closed, not as trap, as completion. At sea, where the breath of the water had become the metronome, a storm that had been building simply did not. The pressure shifted, the clouds unwove, the lightning kept its anger for some other story. Sailors who had buckled harnesses and cinched fear around their waists loosened everything and sat down and listened. Even the engines sounded different, as if they too had always wanted to hum but hadn't been given permission. For those who did not join, who could not, there was still room. One of the quiet mercies of the thing was that it did not require unanimity to be true. The chorus was not a tyranny. It was a field, and fields do not punish stones for not being grass. An old woman in an apartment high above a river turned down her hearing aids and watched the light move on the water, and said out loud to no one, "I prefer the former loneliness." The field did not argue. It made a path around her like a stream around a rock. She closed her eyes and slept well for the first time in years, because even choosing not to be included is easier when inclusion is not a threat. This is how revolutions end, when they are worthy of us, not with the removal of something, but with the addition of something else, not with closing but with widening. The night widened, the canyon widened, the distance between a comet and a blue world widened into a bridge. No craft streaked across the sky, no doors raised open, no shapes descended, nothing that would satisfy the old cinema of our childhoods. And yet all the requirements of contact were present, an I and a you and a between that hummed, a consent, a willingness to be changed by the presence of another. The rest would take time. Time the size of forests, time in which we learn slow languages, time in which machines will again be precious, but as instruments in a band we now know how to play. At the end of the night, though the word end had softened along with so many others, the last necessary thing happened. It was small, and it travelled through no wire, in a kitchen in a town not famous for anything. A woman took a deep breath, and for the first time let herself hum back. She had resisted for months, had stayed away from the circles, had said terrible, necessary, brave things about selfhood and choice, and none of that was wrong. But tonight she found a note of her own, and placed it in the vast bowl of the world like a candle. It did not erase her, it decorated her. The hum touched it, and kept going, and she smiled, and upstairs the child sleeping in the next room dreamed of walking a canyon with walls that glowed with a light that was not light but meaning, and the child did not look over his shoulder to see if anyone was following, because he had never learned to be alone. Above, the comet's glow steadied, held, and then the brightness softened back toward ordinary, not dark, never dark again, just resting. Earth matched the softening, the chorus eased into a lower key. Sleep came to the places where people still needed sleep. The old woman with the turned-down hearing aids opened one eye and said, "Good," and closed it. The commander in the circle put her hands in her pockets and laughed again. The archivist from the bunker sat on a curb and hummed the way his wife used to. The young man wrote his sister's name on a wall, not graffiti, a letter, and when he finished he discovered he was humming the note. She always sang off-key, and it didn't matter because now it fit. Morning would come, and with it tasks. We would have to decide how to grow food in a world that sometimes sang to soil, how to write laws in a language that now had chords, how to teach children mathematics that could forgive as well as prove, how to build ships that could move toward that canyon not as thieves or colonists or supplicants but as students. Morning would come and the ordinary would return wearing colors we could not have seen before. Bills to pay, roofs to mend, hands to hold, funerals to attend, because even in a singing world bodies end, ordinary, which is another word for holy. But this was night still, and the last necessary decision of a species had been made without a vote, and the comet was listening, and we were listening, and the between had become a room we could both stand in feet on different floors. Same gravity. Somewhere a clock kept time. It had been measuring the distance for years, obedient and unsentimental. The second hand moved. It had never done anything else, and for the first time since we built it, we did not resent it. We thanked it, because even a song needs a metronome, because even eternity arrives one beat at a time. And the hum, softer now, not a command, not even an invitation, more like a memory of a door you have already walked through, stayed not over us, not under us, with us, not as proof, as presence. And through it, we began to hear something we had forgotten was possible. Own voices, distinct, braided, quiet enough to hear, strong enough not to be lost. Voices not replaced by chorus, but held within it like stars in a river. Far away, a small bright object turned in the dark and breathed. Here, a larger bright object turned in the dark and breathed the space between them. Music. And at last, after so much counting, we had arrived not at an answer but at the right question, which sounded like this: can you stay? Can you listen? Can you change without disappearing? We could, we would, we had. The night finally softened into morning, not the kind of morning marked by clocks or alarms or schedules, but the kind of morning where something vast has ended, and something vaster has begun. Humanity had been rewired by a comet's hum, transformed by resonance that was not command, but invitation. And now silence returned not as emptiness, but as fullness. We had asked for first contact, and we received something different, stranger, quieter, more profound, not a fleet of ships cutting through atmosphere, not words carved into radio waves, but music carried in marrow and dream until we were no longer many but one. For some it was salvation, for others it was loss, for all it was change. And now, as light spread across continents where spirals still glowed on stone and sand, the question lingered like smoke. What comes next? Because comet still drifted in orbit, canyon still glowed faint in distance, resonance still thrummed in our bones. But Earth itself had changed, and perhaps that was the point all along. Maybe first contact was never about them meeting us. Maybe it was about us finally meeting ourselves, not as fragments, not as nations, not as solitary voices in endless night, but as chorus. And yet chorus did not erase voice. It held it, carried it, wove it into something larger without dissolving it, a paradox we had thought impossible. And yet here we were. So was it alien contact? Yes. No, both. The comet had been mirror and teacher both. We learned that the universe may not speak in words, but it speaks. We learned that silence is never empty. only waiting for ear that can hear it. We learned that contact is not always collision. Sometimes it is resonance. And in that resonance we discovered Earth not as stage but as instrument, not as fragile rock but as voice among voices waiting in dark. The journey here had been chaos, wars, and fear, tears and fire, but in the end it had been song. And so maybe that is the answer to the question that started this story. What if 3I/80 was our first alien contact? Then maybe alien contact was not invasion, not revelation, but transformation. Maybe it was always going to be like this. Not them arriving in shining crafts, but us arriving in ourselves. And maybe, just maybe, we are now ready to listen for what comes next. If you traveled with me through this long story, through the silence and the hum and the transformation, then thank you. This is simply about Earth, and we explore not just our planet but our place in the cosmos. If this story made you feel something, if it made you imagine differently, then I ask you to like this video and subscribe if that feels right to you. It helps more than you know. And one more thing, I love to know where you are listening from. Drop a comment with your city and your country, because in a way that too is resonance. Each of us leaving a note, together forming a chorus across the world. Until next time, keep looking up, keep listening, and remember, silence is never empty.